Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a desert at night. Not the cold, empty kind of darkness you might expect from a place where the sun has scorched the earth all day long, but something warmer, something alive. A darkness that hums and pulses and glows at its edges as if the horizon itself cannot quite decide whether to sleep. The air carries heat even at midnight, a dry, soft warmth that settles around you like a second skin, carrying with it the faint perfume of sage and dust and something sweet and chemical that you cannot quite name. You're standing on the edge of the Mojave Desert in the early 1960s, and somewhere ahead of you, not far, impossibly close for a place that grew out of nothing, the desert is on fire, not with flame, with light. Welcome to Las Vegas, Nevada, in the decade when the word luxury was still being invented and the people who lived it had more money than the country had imagination to contain. This is not a story about gambling. Not exactly. It is a story about what happened when extraordinary wealth met a landscape with no rules, no history, and no ceiling. It is a story about a world that existed for perhaps one golden decade before the world caught up with it and changed it into something else entirely. So breathe slowly. Let your body settle into whatever surface holds you now. The story begins at dusk, when the Nevada sky turns from blue to copper to a deep and impossible violet, and the first lights flicker on along a stretch of road that would come to be called the most glamorous 2 miles on the face of the earth. There is a particular kind of silence that falls over Las Vegas just before the evening begins. It happens around 5 o'clock, when the desert sun has finally released its grip on the city, and the shadows stretch long and blue across the sand and the parking lots, and the wide boulevards that cut through the valley like rivers of asphalt. The casino workers are arriving for the evening shift. The kitchens are coming to life. Somewhere in the back corridors of the great hotels that line Las Vegas Boulevard, the Strip, as everyone has already begun calling it. Men in white jackets are laying out silverware on tablecloths that cost more than a schoolteacher's weekly salary, and then the lights come on. Not gradually, not one by one as you might light candles in a dim room. All at once, as if some invisible hand has thrown an enormous switch, the entire Strip erupts into brilliance. The neon signs, massive, elaborate, some of them 4 and 5 stories tall, blaze to life in colours that have no natural equivalent in the desert landscape that surrounds them. Pinks and yellows and blues so saturated they seem almost edible. Oranges that pulse like something alive. Whites so sharp they cut shadows into the sidewalk below. For a visitor arriving for the first time in those years, the effect was said to be almost physically overwhelming. People stepped out of their taxicabs and simply stopped walking, unable to move for a moment, unable to process what their eyes were being shown. There was nothing else like it in the world. Not Times Square, not the Champs-Élysées, not the illuminated waterfronts of Hong Kong. Las Vegas in the early 1960s was something genuinely unprecedented. A city that had decided to treat wealth not as something to be hidden or tastefully displayed, but as a performance, a spectacle, a gift to anyone fortunate enough to be watching. And the people who had come to watch in those years were among the wealthiest human beings on the planet. Let us be precise about this, because the story we are telling is not the story of ordinary visitors to Las Vegas. It is not the story of the schoolteacher who saved up for a long weekend, or the newlyweds who booked the cheapest room and spent their days at the nickel slot machines. Those people existed, and their story is interesting too, but it is not this story. This is the story of the penthouse suites, the private gaming rooms, the tables where the minimum bet was higher than most families' monthly rent, the dining rooms where the menus had no prices because if you needed to ask, you had been shown to the wrong table. The story of the men, and they were almost entirely men in those years, who arrived in their own aircraft and were met at the airport by drivers in black cars, and were whisked to accommodations that bore no resemblance to what most people understood the word hotel to mean. This is the story of the filthy rich in Las Vegas in the 1960s, and it begins, as all great stories of excess begin, with the architecture. The hotels that defined the Strip in the early years of that decade were not merely places to stay. They were statements. Each one was a declaration of intent, a flag planted in the desert sand, a message sent to the world that said, here, in this unlikely place, in this city that did not exist 40 years ago, we have built something extraordinary. The Sands Hotel and Casino occupied a stretch of the strip that had been desert scrubland not long before. But by the early 1960s, the Sands had become something else entirely, a byword for a particular kind of glamour that mixed Hollywood ease with genuine high-stakes luxury. The building itself was long and low by the standards of what would come later, built in the modernist style that architects called mid-century, all clean lines and warm materials and an aesthetic that suggested both casual elegance and serious money. The sign out front, a curved tower of neon that spelled the hotel's name in letters you could read from half a mile away, had become one of the most recognizable shapes in America. The Desert Inn, farther up the strip, pursued a different vision. Here the ambition was country club, a sense that you had been transported to somewhere in the American Southwest that had been groomed and manicured and civilized to within an inch of its life. There were golf courses, improbable, intensely green golf courses in the middle of the Mojave, maintained at enormous expense against the logic of the climate. There were swimming pools lined with the kind of stone that suggested Mediterranean villas. There was a quietness to the Desert Inn that distinguished it from its louder neighbours, a sense that the wealthy preferred their extravagance served with a certain restraint. The Flamingo, older than most of its neighbours, built in the riotous ambition of the post-war years, bore its history on its face. This was the hotel that had helped invent Las Vegas as a destination, and by the early 1960s it carried that founding mythology with some pride. The pink neon flamingos that gave the place its name were iconic by then, instantly recognisable to anyone who had ever picked up a magazine or watched a newsreel. The flamingo attracted a particular kind of celebrity, the kind who wanted to be seen to be having a very good time in a place that understood exactly what a very good time was supposed to look like. And then there was Caesar's Palace, which had not yet been built in the earliest years of the 1960s, but whose arrival later in the decade would change everything, setting a new standard for what luxury in the desert could aspire to. A standard so audacious, so committed to the idea that Roman imperial excess was the correct aesthetic for a gambling establishment in the Nevada desert, that it remains, decades later, the template against which all subsequent hotel-casino ambition is measured. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let us return to that moment of arrival, that first step out of the cool interior of a luxury automobile onto the sidewalk of Las Vegas Boulevard on a warm evening in, say, 1962. The sounds that greet you are nothing like the sounds of any other city. There is music everywhere, not from speakers mounted on poles, but from live performers in a dozen different venues, their notes, drifting out through open doorways and across the warm evening air. There is the distant chime and clatter of slot machines, a sound so particular to this place that it functions almost as a musical signature, identifying Las Vegas as surely as the foghorn identifies San Francisco. There is the murmur of crowds, the particular sound of large numbers of people engaged in the twin activities of spending money and enjoying themselves, and underneath all of it, barely perceptible but always present, the hum of the electrical systems that power all those lights, a sound like the heartbeat of some enormous, improbable organism. If you are arriving as one of the very wealthy, your experience of all this will be different from the experience of the ordinary visitor in specific and telling ways. You will not stand in line, you will not carry your own luggage, you will not present yourself at the front desk of the hotel and explain who you are and retrieve a key from a hook on a board, behind a counter. All of that has been arranged in advance, through networks of personal assistants and hotel managers who have learned that their most valuable guests expect the invisible management of all practical details as a basic condition of their patronage. If you enjoy listening to History at Midnight stories like this, subscribe. I post stories like this weekly. What you will experience if you are arriving at the Sands or the Desert Inn or the Sahara as a genuine high roller in those years is something closer to the arrival of a dignitary at a private residence. The car will pull up to a specific entrance, not the main entrance, certainly not, and a specific person, someone whose job is to know who you are and to make you feel that your arrival is not just expected but eagerly anticipated, will be there to greet you. Your name will be said aloud, warmly, as if by a friend. Your preferences, and by this point the major hotels maintained extraordinarily detailed records of their important guests' preferences, will already have been communicated to every relevant department of the establishment. The room will be at the correct temperature. The particular brand of whiskey you prefer will be on the bar. The pillow firmness will match whatever your assistant communicated to the hotel's concierge during the reservation process. If you travel with a particular kind of mineral water, it will be there. If you require a specific newspaper delivered at a specific hour, the arrangements will have been made. This is the texture of luxury at its highest expression in early 1960s Las Vegas. Not spectacle, or rather, not only spectacle, anticipation. The sense that everything has been arranged to receive you specifically, that your comfort has been thought about in advance and with care, that you have arrived at a place whose entire purpose is to ensure that nothing about your stay reminds you of ordinary life, because the people who came to Las Vegas in those years with serious money, and when we say serious, we mean the kind of wealth that most Americans could not conceive of, the kind that came from inherited fortunes, from oil discoveries, from the kind of business success that rewrites the rules of an industry. Those people had one primary desire, which was to feel, for a few days or a few weeks, that the normal constraints of existence did not apply to them. They wanted to feel unlimited. And Las Vegas, uniquely among all the places in the world in those years, knew how to provide that feeling. Let the thought of all that light settle over you like a warm blanket. Let the sounds of the strip, the music, the chime of games, the murmur of 1,000 conversations, fade to a soft background hum, like a radio playing 2 rooms away. You're watching it all from a comfortable distance, from a place of rest, with no obligation to participate or perform, just to observe, just to remember there is a floor in most of the great strip hotels from those years that ordinary guests never see. Not the penthouse floor necessarily, though those existed too, a floor that functions as a different kind of hotel entirely, hidden inside the regular hotel the way an egg contains something else, something that exists on different terms from everything around it. This floor is reached by a separate elevator, accessed by a key that is not given to you at check-in but brought to your car. The elevator itself is different, panelled perhaps in something that actually qualifies as wood, or lined in a fabric that has texture and warmth, rather than the anonymous carpeting of the public corridors below. When the elevator doors open on this floor, the silence is the first thing you notice. The noise of the casino, the clatter and chime and occasional roar of a crowd, reacting to an outcome at a gaming table. All of that has been engineered away. The floors are thick, the walls are constructed to absorb sound. The corridor you step into is carpeted in something so deep and soft that your footsteps produce no sound at all, as if you have arrived somewhere that exists outside the ordinary acoustic reality of the building. The suites on this floor are not hotel rooms. This needs to be said plainly, because the word suite has been so thoroughly diluted by its application to rooms that are merely large that it no longer conveys what these spaces actually were. A proper high-roller suite in a major Las Vegas hotel in the early 1960s occupied something between 3,000 and 6,000 square feet. That is the size of a large private home. It contained a living room, a dining room that could seat 12 or 14 guests for a formal dinner, a kitchen staffed by a dedicated chef during your stay, multiple bedrooms with dressing rooms attached, bathrooms finished in materials, marble, gold hardware, imported tile. That would have been considered appropriate for a fine private home in the most expensive neighborhoods of any American city. The furniture was real furniture, not the slightly apologetic built-to-be-replaced furniture of ordinary hotel rooms, but pieces that had been chosen by interior designers who understood the difference between the appearance of luxury and its actual texture and weight. Sofas with deep cushions covered in fabric that had been selected for the feel of it under the hand. Beds with mattresses that had been specified by the hotel's management after conversations with people who understood what a very wealthy guest expected from a night's sleep. There were flowers, always. Arrangements changed daily. Not the modest vases of carnations that decorated ordinary hotel rooms, but substantial arrangements of flowers that had been flown in specifically, that reflected both the season and whatever was known about the preferences of the person who would be sleeping in this room. If you had once, in a hotel in Paris, mentioned offhandedly to a concierge that you found gardenias appealing, and if that concierge had been thorough enough to note it, and that note had eventually made its way into the vast informal network of information that the major hotels maintained about their most important guests, then there would be gardenias in your suite in Las Vegas. The bathrooms deserve particular attention, because in those years, when the suburban American bathroom was still a fairly functional and modest room, the bathrooms in the top suites of Las Vegas hotels were something genuinely different. The Desert Inn, in particular, was known for bathrooms that could be described without exaggeration as palatial. The bathtub was a significant object, not a fixture but a feature, large enough to be genuinely useful for a full soak rather than a perfunctory cleanse, set into a surround of marble that stayed cool to the touch no matter how warm the room became. The mirrors were large and well lit, understanding that the people who used these rooms needed to see themselves clearly and approvingly before appearing in public. The towels were Egyptian cotton, thick and warm and replaced with new ones whenever you so much as used one once, without any need to ask. There was a telephone in the bathroom. There was a telephone in every room, in fact, multiple phones in the suite, because a person of serious means in those years conducted much of their business by telephone, and the idea that a business call might be interrupted by the need to walk to another room was an inconvenience that no serious hotel would impose on a guest of sufficient importance. Now let us think about what it meant to wake up in one of these suites in the morning. The light in Las Vegas is a particular kind of light, brilliant and flat and very slightly harsh in the morning hours, when the sun comes up over the mountains to the east and illuminates the desert with an intensity that the rest of the country does not experience in quite the same way. The curtains in these suites were accordingly blackout curtains, heavy, lined, perfectly hung so that not a sliver of that Nevada dawn could intrude on your sleep unless you specifically wished it to. But when you did decide to wake, the ritual of morning in a serious Las Vegas hotel suite was a pleasure in itself. Coffee arrived. The right coffee, prepared in the way you had specified, in a proper pot with proper cups, not in paper vessels or from a machine in the corner, but from the kitchen where your dedicated staff for this stay had been preparing it since before you woke. The morning newspapers were folded on the table, whichever papers you read, whether that meant the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal or a particular regional paper from your home city that had been air-freighted overnight to ensure its freshness. Breakfast, if you wanted it in the suite, was an occasion. The hotel's kitchen could produce essentially anything. There was no menu, or rather the menu was whatever you desired. If you wanted a breakfast from a particular cuisine that required specific ingredients, those ingredients were procured. If you wanted something your regular cook prepared at home and had once described to a hotel employee in an idle moment, which is the kind of thing that finds its way into guest records at serious establishments, an attempt would be made to replicate it. Not always successfully, but the attempt itself communicated something important, that your preferences were taken seriously, that your comfort was the establishment's primary project. All of this, the suite, the staff, the personalized service, the fresh flowers and the specific coffee, and the perfectly timed newspapers, was, in the language of the hotel industry of the time, complimentary, free, provided at the hotel's expense. This arrangement will seem, from the outside, remarkably generous. Hotels do not typically give away 5,000 square foot suites, and dedicated kitchen staff and flown-in flowers for free. The economics of this deserve examination, because understanding it tells you something important about the particular relationship that existed in those years between the very wealthy and the city of Las Vegas. The comping system, the practice of providing luxury accommodation and services at no charge to high-rolling gamblers, was one of the great financial innovations of the Las Vegas casino industry. Its logic was straightforward. A man who was betting $50,000 or $100,000 at the baccarat table in a single session was generating revenue for the casino that dwarfed the cost of his suite by a factor of 10 or 20 or 100. The suite, the food, the champagne, the shows, all of it was, from the casino's perspective, not generosity, but advertising. It was the cost of acquiring a customer who was worth far more to the bottom line than the accommodation cost. But for the guest, for the man, settling into his armchair after breakfast, looking out through the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse suite at the Nevada desert, stretching away to the mountains in 3 directions, while a staff member refilled his coffee, the financial logic was not the point. The point was the feeling of being provided for, attended to, valued, wanted, the feeling that had motivated his presence in this particular city, in this particular hotel, in this particular chair overlooking this particular stretch of desert. The feeling of being, for a few extraordinary days, unlimited. Let that feeling settle over you gently, like the warmth of morning desert sun coming through glass. You are in no hurry. There is nothing required of you. The morning stretches before you without obligation, without agenda, without any of the ordinary pressures that constitute the texture of daily life for almost everyone else. You're not almost everyone else, not this week. There is a particular night in January 1960 that most historians of Las Vegas point to as the moment when the city's mythology crystallized into its final permanent form. Frank Sinatra was performing at the Copa Room of the Sands Hotel. This in itself was not unusual. Sinatra had been performing at the Sands for years, and his relationship with the hotel was both personal and contractual, a matter of ownership stakes and artistic commitment, and the particular kind of loyalty that governed relationships in the entertainment world of that era. What made this January different was what happened around the performances. During the days while Sinatra and his group performed at the Sands, they were also in production on a film called Ocean's 11, shooting on location in Las Vegas itself, using the Strip's hotels and casinos as their backdrop. The group at the centre of all this, Sinatra, Dean Martin, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, had been given a name by the press, a name they did not entirely embrace but could not escape: the Rat Pack. The combination of the film production and the nightly performances at the Copa Room created something unprecedented in American entertainment. Every night, after the cameras had stopped rolling on whatever location the production had been using that day, the group would arrive at the Sands in a state of creative and social energy that their performances somehow contained and amplified rather than dissipated. The shows were not performances in the conventional sense. They were experiences of a kind that the Copa Room audiences, who were themselves largely wealthy and sophisticated, recognized as rare. The men on stage behaved as if the performance were an afterthought, a pleasant interruption to the ongoing party that they were having among themselves. Dean Martin carried a drink at all times and appeared, to the audience's delighted suspicion, to be genuinely enjoying it rather than managing a prop. Sammy Davis Jr. demonstrated a talent so comprehensive, voice, dancing, physical comedy, straight drama, that the audience found themselves unsure which to watch. Sinatra himself was the centre of gravity around which everything else orbited, and his command of the room was total, effortless, as natural as breathing. For the wealthy guests who paid significant sums for tables at these performances, the experience was unlike anything available elsewhere in the entertainment world of 1960. Broadway offered great theatre, but Broadway was theatrical. It acknowledged the line between performer and audience and treated that line as meaningful. Hollywood offered great films, but films were sealed objects, finished and complete and incapable of surprise. What the Rat Pack offered at the Copa Room was something between performance and reality, something that made the audience feel, whether accurately or not, that they were present at the actual life of these men rather than watching a managed presentation of it. This was extremely valuable to people who could afford anything. The wealthy guests of Las Vegas in those years were, by definition, people who could purchase experiences. They could buy tickets to any event in the world. They could rent private boxes at opera houses and Grand Prix races and championship sporting events. They could hire private performances of almost any kind. What they could not easily purchase was authenticity, the sense that what they were witnessing was real, that the people performing were actually themselves rather than polished professional versions of themselves. The Rat Pack, at the Copa Room, provided something that felt like authenticity. The jokes at each other's expense felt real. The occasional stumble that was immediately incorporated into the show felt real. The evident affection among the performers felt real. Whether or not any of it was as spontaneous as it appeared, the feeling it produced in the room was genuine, and the wealthy audience, members who were seated at those tables, were sophisticated enough to understand the distinction between the feeling and the reality, but sophisticated enough also to understand that the feeling was what they were really paying for. The Copa Room itself was designed for exactly this kind of intimate grand occasion. It was not large by Broadway standards, seating perhaps 500 people at its capacity, with tables arranged so that almost every seat had a clear sightline to the stage. The tables were set formally, with white linens and proper glassware and an abundance of food and drink that reflected the hotel's understanding that its best customers expected serious dining to accompany their entertainment. The room was dark enough to feel private, well enough lit for the performers to be visible, acoustically designed so that a voice could fill it without shouting. If you were a wealthy guest at the Sands in those January nights of 1960, your evening began not in the Copa Room, but in your suite, where you changed into appropriate clothing for dinner and an evening show. The question of appropriate clothing was more specific than it might sound. Las Vegas in those years maintained a genuine dress code. Not the vague and aspirational suggestions that hotels offer today, but actual requirements, enforced at the door by people whose job was to understand the difference between a dinner jacket and a sports coat, and to know which was expected in which venue. For men, this meant a tuxedo for the most formal occasions, the main showroom, the most expensive dining room, and at minimum a dark suit and tie for everything else. The wealthy guests who came to the Strip in those years dressed accordingly, and the effect was to give the public areas of the hotels a visual register that reinforced the sense of occasion. Looking around a room where every man was in a dinner jacket and every woman in an evening gown produced a feeling that something significant was happening, that the evening was worth dressing for. The women of Las Vegas deserve their own consideration here, because the story of wealth in the early 1960s Strip was inseparable from the story of how wealthy women presented themselves in that particular time and place. This was an era when fashion was still largely Parisian in its authority, when the houses of Dior and Balenciaga and Chanel set the terms under which elegance was defined, and when wealthy American women had both the means and the motivation to dress in ways that communicated their status clearly to anyone who understood the codes. A woman in a Nevada showroom in 1962, dressed in a Balenciaga cocktail dress with the appropriate jewellery, was wearing something that her peers could read as accurately as a business card. The dress said, "This person has access to Paris, or to the shops in New York that carry Parisian work." The jewellery, real stones, not paste, and the difference was visible to anyone who had reason. To know said, "This person's access to financial resources is without ordinary limit." The jewels, in particular, deserve a pause. The wives and companions of the very wealthy men who came to Las Vegas in those years wore jewellery that would attract serious attention at any serious auction house today. Diamonds were the foundation, large stones, properly cut, set in platinum by craftsmen whose work was the result of skills acquired over generations. But the most interesting pieces were often something more specific, a suite of sapphires from a particular source, or a set of Colombian emeralds that had been assembled over decades, or a pearl necklace of matched Baroque pearls that had required years of searching to put together. This was jewellery as autobiography, jewellery as evidence of a life lived at a particular altitude. The casino floor was, among other things, a fashion show. The wealthy guests who moved through the gaming rooms of the Sands or the Desert Inn or the Flamingo in those evening hours were simultaneously players and audience, participants in the grand theatrical production that the Strip put on every night. And at the centre of that production, on the nights when the Rat Pack was performing, everything else organised itself. The knowledge that Sinatra was in the building, that Dean Martin had been seen at the bar, that Sammy Davis Jr. had stopped to speak to a group of guests in the lobby, gave the entire hotel a particular electricity, a sense that the normal boundaries between the world of fame and the world of ordinary wealth had been temporarily dissolved. Wealthy guests who might have seen themselves as belonging to a different world from show business entertainers found themselves in the Copa Room and in the corridors and bars of the Sands Hotel in January 1960, sharing the same space as the most famous performers of the age. This was, in its way, a form of social alchemy. Las Vegas was performing a transformation, taking the separated spheres of American life and placing them in a room together and letting the chemistry produce something new. The result was something that the decade of the 1960s would eventually name celebrity culture, the idea that fame itself was a currency, that proximity to fame conferred a kind of status, that the performances of celebrities were not merely entertainment, but events of social significance. All of this was being worked out in those copper room evenings on those winter nights in Las Vegas in 1960, with the desert dark and cold outside and the room inside blazing with light and laughter, and the sound of Dean Martin's voice wrapping itself around a melody, with the ease of something completely natural. You can hear it, can't you? That sound, that era. Even now, decades later, there is something in a certain quality of light, warm, amber, cast by fixtures that were designed to flatter, that brings it back. You're not there exactly, but you are in the presence of something that was there, something that has persisted. Let it wash over you like music heard from across water, present and distant at once, warm and exact and absolutely itself. There is a particular economy of motion that characterizes the serious gambler at work. The tourist at the slot machine is immediately visible by their engagement. Leaning forward, watching the spinning symbols with bright, focused attention, reacting to each outcome with a small performance of emotion, hope or disappointment, or the particular giddy excitement of a small win. They are players in the most literal sense, fully absorbed in the game, its outcomes mattering to them in a way that connects to the rest of their emotional life. The serious gambler at a high-stakes table in a Las Vegas casino of the early 1960s looked and behaved completely differently. He sat with a stillness that was conspicuous among the more animated players at adjacent tables. The movements of his hands were economical, placing bets and receiving cards with the practiced ease of someone for whom these gestures are as automatic as lifting a fork. His face communicated very little. The connection between his internal state and his external expression had been carefully, deliberately severed, whether through long practice or through the particular dissociation that very large amounts of money can produce in the people who have sufficient quantities of it. Because what was at stake at the tables available to the very wealthy in those casinos was genuinely large. The baccarat room, and baccarat was the game of choice for the higher stakes players in those years, partly because it required no skill, and therefore offered no psychological escape route into the fantasy that talent would prevail. The baccarat room was a different environment from the main casino floor. In most of the major hotels, it occupied a separate space, accessible through a discreet doorway that was not prominently marked. The room was quieter, slightly more formal, and served by staff who were specifically assigned to it and trained in the particular requirements of tending to very wealthy people engaged in very large financial transactions in a state of what was designed to look like relaxation. The minimum bet at a serious baccarat table in a major Las Vegas hotel in the early 1960s was genuinely significant. The maximum bet was, in the most serious rooms, essentially determined by the bankroll of the player and the appetite of the house. There was a number above which the casino would decline to take on more risk from a single player in a single session. But that number was large enough that it functioned not as a cap on ambition but as evidence that the casino was being managed with commercial prudence. What did it feel like to bet that kind of money? The accounts of people who did it regularly suggest that the relationship between the actual sums involved and their emotional weight became, over time, attenuated. The first time you bet $10,000 on the turn of a card, the physical sensation was reportedly significant. An acceleration of the heart rate, a particular quality of attention, a heightening of the senses that was related to the body's recognition of genuine risk. The 1,000th time you bet $10,000, the body had largely adjusted to the significance of the number, and the card turned without the same biological drama. This is one of the peculiar features of very large wealth. It gradually eliminates the physical and emotional vocabulary that most people use to experience the difference between having something and losing it. When the amount you're betting at the baccarat table represents a fraction of your total resources, when losing it would not change anything of material significance in your daily life, the loss of it becomes, in a sense, theoretical. The casinos understood this dynamic and designed their entire operation around it. The chips were part of this design. Substituting colourful discs of plastic for actual currency accomplishes a specific psychological effect that the casino industry had understood since the beginning. It abstracts the money, removes it one step from its literal reality, makes it possible to push a stack of chips worth $10,000 across a felt table with a gesture that would be unthinkable if you were pushing actual currency. The chips have weight and colour and a pleasant sound against each other, but they do not look or feel like money in a way that triggers the full weight of the psychological associations money carries. The cocktail service was part of the design too. Complimentary drinks, available without limit, without ever having to order or pay. This also accomplished several specific purposes simultaneously. It kept players in their seats. It relaxed whatever inhibitory impulses they brought to the table. It signaled that the casino valued their presence and was investing in their comfort. And it maintained, very subtly, the sense that the normal transactional nature of the world, where things cost money and you must weigh what you receive against what you pay, had been suspended. Everything in the casino said, the normal rules do not apply here. The specific rooms available to the largest spenders went further. In some of the major casinos, there were truly private gaming experiences available. Rooms or suites where a single player or a small group could conduct their gambling entirely away from the rest of the casino, attended by dedicated staff, with the stakes and the rules negotiated directly with management rather than posted on a sign. These rooms were where some of the largest single-session wins and losses in American gambling history were recorded. The amounts are staggering, even accounting for inflation. There are accounts of single evenings at baccarat in these rooms where the amounts that moved between the player and the house exceeded the annual salary of every employee in the hotel combined, and the men who sat at those tables, calm, still, occasionally sipping from the glass at their elbow, placing their bets with the specific economy of motion that distinguished the serious gambler from the merely excited one, were people for whom the money was real, but the losing of it was, in some fundamental way, acceptable. Not pleasant necessarily, but acceptable, because they had bought, with their presence at that table, something more valuable than the money they might lose. They had bought the feeling of absolute presence in a moment, the particular quality of aliveness that comes from genuine risk, from being genuinely uncertain about the outcome of something that matters. For people whose wealth had gradually eliminated most genuine uncertainty from their lives, whose hotels were always ready, whose food was always prepared, whose travel was always arranged, whose days were largely predictable because they had the resources to make them so, the uncertainty of a high-stakes card game was a form of intensity that money could buy but could not manufacture any other way. The casino gave them back the feeling of not knowing what would happen next. It is a strange and somewhat melancholy thing to need to purchase, but it is, if you think about it, entirely human. Let that thought settle gently. The cards turn in the darkness of a private room. The chips make their soft plastic sound against each other. A man's face reveals nothing. Somewhere above him, in the suite that the hotel has prepared at no charge for his stay, the flowers are fresh and the bed has been turned down precisely. He is having, by any objective measure, a wonderful time. In the early 1960s, the finest restaurants in the United States were located, with very few exceptions, in New York City. The great French establishments, Le Pavillon, Lutèce, La Caravelle, set the standard against which serious dining in America was measured, and that standard was French, classical technique, formal service, an implicit understanding that eating well was a matter of education and ceremony as much as appetite. Las Vegas in those years had no culinary tradition of its own. It was a city that had grown too quickly to accumulate the slow sediment of food culture that gives cities their gastronomic character. There was no local cuisine, no indigenous ingredient that the desert produced in abundance, no immigrant community that had imported and adapted and transformed a culinary heritage. What Las Vegas had instead was money and ambition, and it turned out that money and ambition, applied to the problem of fine dining, could produce something that competed seriously with the established centres of American gastronomy, at least for the specific kind of diner who arrived with a fat wallet and a schedule that imposed no deadline on the evening's pleasures. The great hotel restaurants of the Strip in those years approached their work with a seriousness that surprised visitors who expected casino food to be an afterthought. The Desert Inn's restaurant maintained a wine cellar that serious collectors acknowledged as significant, not just well-stocked but thoughtfully assembled, representing the kind of collecting that required knowledge as well as money. The Sands employed French-trained chefs for its main dining room, who had worked in kitchens that would have been respectable in Paris. The Flamingo imported ingredients that lesser restaurants would not have thought to procure. But the most important feature of dining for the seriously wealthy in Las Vegas in those years was not available in any restaurant, however excellent. It was available in the suites. In-room dining, in the penthouse suites of the major hotels, operated on principles that bore no resemblance to the room service available to ordinary hotel guests. There was no menu, or rather, the menu was whatever the guest desired, within the reasonable limits of what an excellent kitchen could procure and prepare. The time was whenever the guest wished to eat. The table, an actual table, with proper linens and silverware and glassware set up in the dining room of the suite, was laid with the formality of a private dining room, because that is essentially what it was. If you were a wealthy guest staying at the Desert Inn in 1962, and you decided, at 11 o'clock in the evening, that you wanted a proper dinner, this could be arranged. Not a sandwich or a reheated plate of something prepared earlier, but a genuine dinner, soup, fish course, main course, dessert, cheese. Proper wine service with a sommelier who appeared not from a staff pool but from a specific individual who had been briefed about your preferences and who understood that your request for a particular Burgundy was not a casual suggestion, but a genuine requirement. The preparation of a dinner at such an hour for such a guest was genuinely demanding, and the kitchens of the major hotels employed staff specifically to meet this demand. There were cooks who worked through the night for precisely this purpose, not to prepare for the breakfast service that would begin in a few hours, but to be available for the needs of guests whose schedules did not conform to the rhythms of the working day. This is worth pausing on, because it represents something specific about the relationship between wealth and time. Most people live within the constraints that time imposes on them. Restaurants close at a certain hour, shops open at a certain hour, services are available within windows defined by the working hours of the people who provide them. This is the normal structure of the world, and most people navigate it as a given, as background, as unexaminable as the fact of gravity. For the very wealthy guests of Las Vegas in those years, this structure was optional. The city's entire service economy was organized around providing, for those who could pay for it, relief from the tyranny of standard hours. The casinos never closed, the room service never stopped. The entertainment ran until the small hours of the morning. The bars served whenever there were customers. The city was, in a sense, post-temporal. It existed outside the rhythms of the ordinary day, and its most expensive accommodations existed outside those rhythms in the most complete way possible. A wealthy guest at the Desert Inn in those years could sleep until 3 in the afternoon, wake to a breakfast prepared to order, spend the late afternoon at the pool or on the golf course, dine formally at 10 in the evening, watch a show at midnight, gamble until 4 in the morning, and return to his suite to find that the bed had been freshly turned down and that the kitchen was available if he wanted a light supper before sleeping. Time, for him, was not a constraint. It was a medium in which he moved at his own pace, shaped to his preferences by the people and institutions whose business it was to shape it. Now, the food itself. Let us be specific. Let us sit imaginatively at the table in the suite dining room of the Sands Hotel on a Tuesday evening in 1963. The table has been set with the hotel's finest linen, a tablecloth of sufficient weight and quality that it falls to within an inch of the floor, perfectly pressed, without a single crease that was not intended. The silverware is heavy, the pattern distinctive, the pieces placed with the precision that formal service demands. The glassware is crystal, actual crystal, with the slight weight and resonance that distinguishes it from ordinary glass, and several glasses have been set at each place, for water, for the different wines, for whatever digestif might follow. There is candlelight. In the suite, at this hour, with the desert dark outside the floor-to-ceiling windows and the lights of the Strip, visible in the distance and a constellation laid on its side, glittering and restless, candlelight produces an atmosphere that the best restaurant cannot quite replicate, because the best restaurant shares its atmosphere with other diners, other tables, other conversations. Here the candlelight is entirely yours. The first course is a cold soup, not gazpacho, which would be too Spanish and too informal, but a vichyssoise of potatoes and leeks made with cream that comes from dairy animals whose diet has been carefully managed, producing milk of unusual richness. The soup arrives at the correct temperature, barely cold enough to be refreshing, but not so cold that it numbs the palate. In a bowl of proper depth, with a small garnish of chives from the kitchen's own herb garden, which the hotel maintains on the roof specifically for this purpose. You take a spoonful. The texture is velvet, the flavour both mild and complex in the way that the best simple food achieves. You can identify each component: potato, leek, cream, a whisper of chive. But the combination produces something that is greater than its parts, something that rewards attention, and rewards the quality of attention that slowing down and eating carefully, without distraction or obligation, makes possible. This is food at its highest expression. Not elaborate food, not the ambitious technical complexity that would come to define the finest restaurant cooking a few decades later, but food made with exceptional ingredients by skilled hands and served in conditions that allow its qualities to be appreciated. Between the courses, there is conversation, or silence, or whatever you wish. There is no obligation to perform sociability for a room of strangers, no sense that the pace of your eating is being managed by a kitchen that needs to turn the table for a second seating. The evening is yours. This, perhaps more than the suite, more than the gaming room, more than the show with Sinatra at midnight. This, the private dinner served at your own pace in your own dining room, is the clearest expression of what extraordinary wealth actually purchased in Las Vegas in those years. Not spectacle in the end. Silence. Time. The luxury of being present without hurry. The Las Vegas Strip in the daytime is a different place from the Las Vegas Strip at night, and the difference tells you something important about the city's relationship with its own identity. At night, the Strip is what you imagine it to be. Brilliant, excessive, in total command of its effect. The neon is at its best in darkness. The crowds are at their densest in the evening hours. The shows, the gambling, the social theatre of wealth on display, all of it is fundamentally nocturnal, designed to function under artificial light in conditions of suspended time. In the daytime, the Strip sits in the Nevada sun and looks, with some areas, frankly underdressed. The neon signs, so spectacular at night, are in daylight just large structures of glass tubes mounted on metal frameworks. The hotels, stripped of the atmospheric lighting that makes them glamorous after dark, reveal themselves as what they essentially are. Large buildings designed to house a great many people and a great many gaming tables, with ambitions that the architecture sometimes strains to meet. But the daytime at the major hotels was not the main casino floor and the showrooms. The daytime for the wealthy guests was the private spaces, the pool areas, the spa facilities, the golf courses, that were as carefully designed and maintained as everything else, but that operated under the logic of the sun rather than the logic of spectacle. The pool at the Desert Inn deserves particular attention. By the standards of the early 1960s, the Desert Inn's pool was magnificent. It was large enough to actually swim in, a consideration that many hotel pools of the era ignored in favour of decorative effect, and surrounded by an area of pale stone decking that stayed warm in the sun without becoming uncomfortably hot. The chaises longues that lined the pool area were actual furniture, not the plastic-strapped beach chairs that most hotels considered adequate, but cushioned pieces with a solidity and comfort that invited lying still for extended periods. The service at the pool was what you would expect: continuous, unhurried, responsive, without being intrusive. A server materialized when your glass was approaching empty. Cold towels appeared when the Nevada sun, which in the summer months achieves a genuine intensity, made their application welcome. Food was available, cold food, primarily appropriate to the poolside setting, though the kitchen would produce anything requested. What is interesting about the pool experience for very wealthy guests in those years is how it differs from what you might expect. The wealthy visitors to Las Vegas in those years did not, for the most part, wish to sit at the pool and be noticed. The pool was not primarily a stage for the display of the body and the jewels and the status objects that the casino floor and the showroom might be. The pool was rest, genuine physical rest, in the warmth of the Nevada sun, in a setting of sufficient quality that the act of resting did not carry any associations of compromise or reduction. This distinction between the public performance of wealth, which the evening hours demanded, and the private enjoyment of it, which the daylight hours offered, was important to the people who understood Las Vegas at its highest level. They were not performing all the time. They were not permanently in the state of effortful display that the word glamour sometimes suggests. They were also, and sometimes primarily, resting, genuinely resting, in conditions specifically designed to make rest as comfortable and complete as possible. The golf courses were perhaps the most dramatic example of this aspiration. Golf had been, since its adoption by wealthy Americans in the early 20th century, a sport inseparable from the culture of privilege. The private golf club was one of the primary institutions of American upper-class life, a space defined by exclusion, maintained at considerable expense, providing both a recreational activity and a social environment in which relationships that would later produce commercial and political outcomes were constructed and maintained. Las Vegas, in the early 1960s, had no private golf clubs in the traditional sense, or rather the golf courses that existed were associated with the hotels rather than operating as the kind of membership organizations that wealthy Americans knew from their home cities. The Desert Inn's golf course was the most famous of these, an 18-hole course maintained in defiance of the desert climate that surrounded it, watered and groomed to produce a surface that players accustomed to the best courses in the country would recognize as adequate and frequently acknowledge as surprisingly excellent. Playing golf in Las Vegas in those years, if you were a high-roller guest of the Desert Inn, meant playing on a course that had been specifically designed to accommodate the specific category of golfer who played there: wealthy, serious, used to good conditions, and very likely accompanied by other wealthy, serious men with whom relationships of significant commercial or social consequence were being maintained and developed. The golf game was also, and this was understood by everyone who played and by everyone who organised such games, a continuation of the casino's work by other means. The time on the course, 4 hours or more in each other's company, walking the same ground, sharing the minor victories and frustrations of the game, was time during which the relationships that the casino's social environment cultivated were deepened and made more specific. The caddies, like all the service staff, of the major Las Vegas hotels in those years were specifically trained for the range of human types they would encounter. The very wealthy are not a monolith. Their wealth takes different forms, produces different personalities, generates different needs. Some wealthy guests were demanding and specific. Some were warmly social. Some were preoccupied with concerns that had nothing to do with their time in Las Vegas, and who needed the service environment to function with absolute efficiency and minimum friction, precisely because they had no mental space to spare for dealing with its problems. Some were genuinely relaxed, genuinely enjoying themselves, genuinely present in the way that the best vacations produce. The staff learned to read these distinctions quickly and accurately, because their livelihood depended on it, but also because, and this is a human thing, not just a commercial one, the people who served the wealthy in those hotels were often genuinely interested in the variety of human character their work brought them into contact with. Now let the afternoon pass. The sun has moved across the Nevada sky, that particular blue sky that the desert produces, higher and more intense in colour than the sky in most other places, and is beginning its descent toward the spring mountains to the west. The air is cooling slightly. At the pool, a few people have gathered their things and gone inside. On the golf course, the last foursome of the afternoon is making its way toward the 18th green. In a few hours the strip will light up again, but for now, in this particular golden late afternoon, there is a stillness. The kind of stillness that the desert produces when you stop trying to resist it. Let that stillness settle in your chest like something warm. There is a story beneath the story of Las Vegas in the 1960s, and no telling of that decade's particular glamour is complete without acknowledging it. The hotels were not built and operated by the men whose names were on the marquees. They were built substantially with money that came from sources that preferred not to advertise themselves. Sources that the general public, if they thought about it at all, discussed in whispers and with a certain theatrical thrill. The connection between organised crime and the development of the Las Vegas Strip is one of the most thoroughly documented, most publicly acknowledged, and yet somehow still most surprising features of American business history in the mid-20th century. The logic was, in retrospect, simple. Las Vegas in the 1940s and 1950s was one of the few places in the United States where gambling was legal, and legal gambling, properly organised, was capable of generating extraordinary sums of money. The difficulty was that legitimate capital was reluctant to invest in an industry, with the social associations that gambling carried. The moral stigma, the political risk, the regulatory uncertainty. The men who were willing to invest and who had access to the kind of capital that building a major casino hotel required were the men who had accumulated that capital through activities that had not previously required the approval of legitimate financial institutions. They arrived in Las Vegas and they built things. The Flamingo, opened in 1947, is the most famous early example, built by Bugsy Siegel with capital from the mob operations he represented, and opened with a celebrity-studded party that established the template for Las Vegas hotel openings for the next 2 decades. Siegel was murdered before the Flamingo could demonstrate its commercial potential, but his idea proved correct. Wealthy Americans wanted a glamorous destination where they could gamble legally, and if the destination was sufficiently glamorous, they would come in sufficient numbers to generate the profits his backers had anticipated. What followed in the late 1940s and through the 1950s was an investment of mob capital into the construction of the Strip that transformed the Nevada desert into something approaching a major entertainment destination. The Desert Inn, the Sands, the Sahara, the Riviera, each of these was capitalized in whole or in part by money that had been accumulated through activities whose profits were not subject to taxation in the conventional sense, and each of them was operated with the kind of financial creativity that such origins required. The skim, the practice of removing cash from the casino's counted revenue before it could be officially recorded, and therefore before it could be taxed, was one of the primary financial mechanisms of this arrangement. Money moved from the gaming tables through a counting process that was carefully managed to ensure that certain amounts never appeared in the official books, and those amounts were distributed to the various interests that had provided the capital for the hotel's construction. It was, from the perspective of the United States government, large-scale tax fraud. From the perspective of the people involved, it was the cost of doing business in an environment that had no other viable source of capital. The wealthy guests who came to the Strip in the early 1960s knew this, in the way that sophisticated people know things without necessarily needing to say them explicitly. They understood that the hotel they were staying in had been built with money whose origins were not entirely respectable, and they understood that the man who comped their suite and ensured that their particular preferences were catered to was connected, through layers of intermediaries or sometimes quite directly, to organizations that operated outside the law. Did this bother them? For most, apparently not, or not sufficiently to affect their behavior. The wealthy guests of the Strip in those years were, by and large, people who had a pragmatic relationship with the law, not criminals, most of them, but people who understood that the laws governing commerce and finance were partially made by people like themselves for purposes that included their own benefit, and that the relationship between legal activity and ethical activity was not always as close as the law's self-presentation suggested. Besides, the experience was simply too good. The suites were too comfortable, the food was too excellent, the entertainment was too spectacular, and the particular alchemy of money and glamour and desert strangeness that Las Vegas achieved was available nowhere else. If the price of that experience included a degree of philosophical agnosticism about the origins of the capital that had made it possible, well, the wealthy are practiced at separating what they want from the conditions that make it available. There were also, by the early 1960s, changes underway that would gradually alter this situation. Howard Hughes, the reclusive aviation magnate and film producer who had retreated to Las Vegas as his eccentricities advanced into something that looked increasingly like genuine mental disturbance, was beginning to buy casinos with legitimate money, displacing the mob interest that had previously held them. The FBI was paying closer and closer attention to the skim operations. State gaming regulators, under increasing federal pressure, were developing the ability to conduct actual oversight of casino finances rather than accepting whatever the casino operators chose to present. But in those early years of the decade, the structure that the mob had built was still largely intact, and the wealthy guests who benefited from it moved through its product, the hotels, the rooms, the service, the entertainment, without feeling for the most part anything other than the pleasure of being very well taken care of. The men who ran the hotels were often, in their way, compelling figures. They understood people. They understood what wealthy people wanted and needed and feared. They understood the psychology of service and the psychology of gambling, and the psychology of the particular social performance that the Strip demanded from everyone who participated in it. They were not, many of them, educated in conventional ways, but they were educated in the University of Human Nature, and their education produced practical competencies that the conventional executive could not easily match. A casino host in those years, the person whose specific job was to identify and cultivate and maintain relationships with the high-rolling guests who generated the bulk of the casino's revenue, was required to be simultaneously many things. He was a concierge, in the sense of knowing what his guests wanted and arranging for it. He was a psychologist in the sense of understanding the emotional states that drove gambling behavior, and knowing how to manage those states in the interest of the house. He was a social director, in the sense of knowing which of his guests should be introduced to each other, and which should be kept apart. And he was, in a deep and genuine sense, a friend, or something that functioned emotionally as a friend, that produced in the guest the feeling of having a loyal and capable ally in the impersonal environment of a large hotel. The best casino hosts of those years were legendary figures within the industry, people whose relationships with specific high rollers spanned decades, and whose knowledge of their guests was extraordinarily detailed. They knew who was fighting with their wife, and who was in trouble with a business partner, and who was grieving and who was celebrating. They knew who gambled to escape and who gambled for the pure joy of the game, and who gambled because it was what their social circle did, and they could not gracefully absent themselves from it. And they used this knowledge, always, in the service of keeping the guest happy and present and gambling, with a skill that was, in its way, an art form. The late hours of the evening were when this art was most visible. A successful casino host at the Sands or the Sahara in those years moved through the gaming room with the ease of someone entirely comfortable in their environment, speaking to this guest, briefly acknowledging that one, arranging for a particular bottle to be sent to a third. They were lubricating the social machinery of the casino in real time, ensuring that nothing created friction or discomfort for the guests whose presence was most commercially significant. It was, if you looked at it with a certain kind of eye, beautiful, efficient and human at once, a system for providing pleasure that had evolved over many years and incorporated extraordinary amounts of learning about what specific kinds of people wanted from a specific kind of experience. The light in the gaming room was warm and yellow and cast few shadows. The sounds were constant but not intrusive. The chips made their soft sound against each other. At the edges of the room, in the near darkness beyond the tables, the casino hosts moved, watching, remembering, attending. The entertainers who worked Las Vegas in those years inhabited a world that was, in important respects, different from the world of their audiences and different also from the world of celebrity as it was understood in other contexts. In New York or Hollywood, a performer of significant reputation moved through a world that was largely defined by the work, the film set, the recording studio, the Broadway stage. The performance was the centre of their professional identity, and everything else, the public appearances, the social engagements, the management of their image and their relationships, organised itself around and in service of the work. In Las Vegas in the early 1960s, the relationship between performance and life was different, and the difference was consequential. The performers who came to the Strip, Sinatra, Martin, Davis, but also Nat King Cole, Louis Prima, Keely Smith, Don Rickles, Wayne Newton in his early appearances, and dozens of others whose names have not endured with equal persistence. These performers lived in the hotels during their engagements. They ate in the hotel's restaurants. They slept in the hotel's suites. They socialized in the hotel's bars and gaming rooms. For the 2 or 3 or 4 weeks of a typical engagement, the hotel was home, and the hotel's social world was their social world. This created an intimacy, or the feeling of intimacy, between performer and guest that was genuinely unusual by the standards of the entertainment industry. If you were staying at the Sands during a Sinatra engagement in those years, you would not merely see Sinatra on stage. You would encounter him at the pool in the afternoon, possibly, though by this point in his career Sinatra was careful about his informal appearances and managed the terms of his accessibility quite deliberately. You would encounter members of his circle at the bar, at the gaming tables, in the corridors. The social world of the hotel during a major engagement was populated by people whose names you recognized from magazines and screens, and the physical scale of the hotel was small enough that these encounters were possible without requiring any particular effort or intrusion. The performers also gambled, most of them, and gambled seriously. Dean Martin's relationship with gambling was casual and good-humoured in public. He performed a persona of elegant dissolution that made his presence at a gaming table feel like an extension of the show. Sinatra gambled with the same focused intensity he brought to his music, attentively, with real engagement in the outcome. Sammy Davis Jr. was reported to have gambling habits that sometimes alarmed his friends and business associates, habits that the casino environment of Las Vegas did nothing to moderate. The relationship between the hotels and the major performers had a quality that normal employer-employee relationships lacked. The casinos needed the performers more urgently than the performers needed any particular casino. Sinatra could, and at one point famously did, take his engagement to another hotel. This gave him, and performers of comparable commercial weight, a leverage that they exercised, sometimes graciously, sometimes with the high-handedness that their position made possible. The backstage world of a Las Vegas hotel show in those years was less glamorous than the show itself, as backstage worlds inevitably are. The performers waited in dressing rooms that were comfortable but not extravagant, attended by the personal assistants and musical directors and managers who constituted the practical machinery of a major entertainer's professional life. There was ritual, the specific sequence of activities that preceded going on stage, the particular foods or drinks that were required or avoided, the vocal exercises or the quiet time, or the intense focused socializing that different performers needed to arrive at the state from which they could perform. And then the show, and then the after. The period after the midnight show, the second show of the evening, the one that ran from about midnight to 1 or 1:30 in the morning, and that was attended by audiences who were at the later and more energized end of their evening. The period that followed this show was, for many of the performers and many of the wealthy guests, the true heart of the Las Vegas experience. It is after 1 in the morning. The Copa room has emptied. The audience has dispersed into the gaming rooms and the bars and the other social spaces of the hotel. The performers have fulfilled their formal obligation and are now, technically, free. And in a specific room in the hotel, sometimes the suite of the headline performer, sometimes a particular restaurant that has been kept open specifically for this purpose, sometimes a bar that has been cleared of its general population to provide a private space, the real party begins. This is not a performance. There are no tickets to this. There is no formal invitation, no mechanism by which ordinary members of the public can purchase entry. Attendance is determined by a combination of celebrity, genuine friendship, the particular quality of relationship that exists between the hotel and its most important guests, and the inclination of the performers themselves. What happened in those rooms in the small hours of Las Vegas mornings in the early 1960s is part of the mythology of the era. The music that was played, informally, for rooms of people who included some of the most famous musicians of the 20th century. The conversations that crossed the boundaries of the different worlds, show business, organized crime, legitimate wealth, politics, that converged in Las Vegas in those years. The jokes and the songs and the arguments and the improbable alliances that the particular alchemy of late-night Las Vegas produced. Some of it has been documented. A great deal of it has not. The rooms had no recording equipment. The conversations were, by mutual understanding, private. What happens in Las Vegas? This principle, which the city would later codify into a marketing campaign, was, in those years, observed not because it was a clever slogan, but because everyone present understood that the exceptional intimacy of those after-hours rooms depended on the absolute reliability of discretion. The wealthy guests who were privileged to attend understood this. They had been welcomed into a world that was not normally available to them, the actual unmediated company of the people they had paid to watch from a distance. And the price of admission was the absolute certainty that what they witnessed would remain private. Most of them kept their word. Most of those rooms remained sealed, their contents reduced to the imprecise memories of people who were, perhaps not by the late hour, in the most reliable state for accurate recollection. But the feeling of those rooms, the warmth, the music, the sense of being present at something genuine and unrepeatable, that has persisted. It comes through in the faces of people who were there when they are asked about it decades later. A particular quality of light in their eyes, the slight pause before speaking, as if they are not quite sure how to describe something that resisted description even at the time. Something happened in those rooms, something that the Strip, at its best and most genuine, produced and cannot be reproduced. The music played on. The desert was dark outside. The lights of the Strip, visible from every window, blazed and pulsed and cooled through the night. Everything changes. It is the nature of exceptional moments that they are, by definition, temporary. The very qualities that make them exceptional, the specific alignment of people and circumstances and cultural forces that produce something genuinely unprecedented, are fragile, dependent on conditions that cannot be held in place indefinitely. Las Vegas in the early 1960s existed in a particular moment that was, even as it was being lived, already beginning to pass. The mob's control of the Strip was being challenged by the federal government's increasing capacity and willingness to investigate and prosecute casino fraud. Howard Hughes, arriving in Las Vegas in 1966 and beginning to acquire casinos with legitimate money, would within a few years transform the ownership structure of the Strip in ways that changed its character permanently. The enormous wealth that had flowed through the skim operations and into the pockets of the men who had built the hotels would be redirected into legitimate corporate structures. With all the transparency and regulation that legitimate corporate structures entail, the performers were changing too. Sinatra's relationship with the Sands ended acrimoniously in 1967 when gambling debt and alcohol, both playing roles in a confrontation that resulted in physical damage to casino property and the permanent rupture of a relationship that had defined both the artist and the hotel for more than a decade. He moved to Caesar's Palace, the new hotel that had opened in 1966, and that represented the new Las Vegas, the Las Vegas of corporate ambition, an explicit mythological reference, and a scale that left the intimate glamour of the early sands behind. The Rat Pack, as a social and creative entity, was already dissolving. The friendships remained. They were real, whatever else might be said about the mythology that surrounded them, but the specific chemistry of that specific group in that specific moment was not renewable. People aged. Priorities shifted. The world of 1960 was genuinely different from the world of 1967, and the performers who had embodied one world could not simply transplant themselves into another without loss. The guests changed too. The 1960s were, beyond Las Vegas, a decade of extraordinary social upheaval. The civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the counterculture, the reassessment of inherited structures of authority and privilege that touched every institution of American life. The wealthy Americans who had come to the Strip in those early years with their dividend income and their inherited assumptions about what luxury looked like were not insulated from these changes, however much the Strip's carefully managed environment attempted to create an atmosphere of permanent suspended time. The young people who would eventually inherit the wealth of those early 1960s high rollers were, by the mid-decade, beginning to express a different relationship with money and ostentation, and the kind of formal glamour that the Strip demanded. The tuxedo as required attire for a casino visit was already beginning to feel, to a certain generation, like an artifact. The specific social world that had crystallized around the Strip, the gossip columns, the celebrity culture, the mixture of old money and new, of Hollywood and Wall Street and organized crime, was beginning to show the cracks that would eventually produce its dissolution. But before the dissolution, there was a last season of extraordinary richness. Perhaps 1963, perhaps 1964. The specific year is less important than the feeling, the sense that everything had come together, that Las Vegas had achieved for a brief interval something close to its own idea of itself. The hotels were at the peak of their original vision before the rebuilding and expansion that would change their character. The performers were at the height of their powers, Sinatra in those years producing some of the finest recordings of his career, Dean Martin arriving at the relaxed mastery that would define his most successful period, Sammy Davis Jr. in the full flowering of a talent that had no limits. The gaming rooms were full, with the kind of guests who understood what they were doing and had the resources to do it without restraint. And the nights were long and warm and brilliant with light. You could stand at the window of your suite in those years, the wide window of the upper floor looking out over the desert that surrounded this improbable city, and see in all directions the darkness of the Mojave pushing back against the illumination of the Strip. The darkness was winning in those years, just barely. You could still see the stars from that window, the vast and brilliant desert sky that the light pollution of later decades would entirely obscure. The Milky Way was visible if you stood at the window at the right hour and looked in the right direction, away from the Strip. There was something extraordinary about that juxtaposition, the most artificially illuminated place in America, with the natural desert darkness at its edges, the most human-constructed environment imaginable with the most ancient and inhuman landscape just outside, the sound of Sinatra's voice carrying from the Copa Room somewhere below into a night that had heard nothing but wind and coyotes for 10,000 years before the neon arrived. It could not last. It was never meant to last. The conditions that produced it were specific and temporary, dependent on a particular alignment of legal ambiguity, an accumulated wealth and cultural moment and individual talent that would not come together again in quite that way. But while it lasted, for those handful of years when everything was new and nothing had yet been exhausted, and the desert was dark at the edges and the lights were bright at the centre, it was something that the people who witnessed it and participated in it and remembered it could not quite leave behind. They carried it with them. The wealthy guests who returned to their ordinary lives after a week at the Sands or the Desert Inn carried something back with them. Not a souvenir, not a story exactly, but a feeling. A memory of what it had been like to be unlimited, even briefly, even at the cost of an admission that could be measured only in the largest denominations. The feeling persisted. It persists still, in the stories told by people who were there, in the recordings that survived, in the photographs taken by people who understood that they were present at something that would not come again. Las Vegas changed, America changed, the world changed. But for a few years in the early 1960s, in the Nevada desert, something happened that deserved to be remembered, and now you remember it. The journey to Las Vegas, for the very wealthy, was itself a statement. Not an ordeal, not a series of transfers and delays and the managed indignity of commercial aviation, but something that was, at its best and most fully expressed, a continuation of the luxury that awaited at the destination. By the early 1960s, private aviation had become sufficiently mature as an industry that the wealthiest Americans could travel between cities without contact with this commercial airline system at all. The aircraft available to a man of genuine means in those years were not the modest propeller-driven machines of the previous decade, but true jets, specifically a new generation of small jet aircraft that had found their way from military production into the hands of private owners, aircraft capable of crossing the country in hours rather than the better part of a day. The experience of arriving in Las Vegas on a private jet in 1962 or 1963 began at a different terminal than the one that served commercial passengers. McCarran Field, as the airport was then known, had designated areas for private and corporate aviation that were separate from the main terminal building in both physical location and atmosphere. Here there were no lines, no announcements echoing from public address systems, no crowds navigating the organised confusion of a busy commercial airport. There was a lounge, a quiet one, with comfortable furniture and attentive service. There was a parking area for the cars that would be waiting when the plane arrived. Not taxicabs, but specific vehicles, specific drivers, the same people who had met this particular passenger before, and who had been briefed on whatever arrangements had been made for this particular visit. The logistics of arrival were managed in advance, and to a standard of seamlessness that made the transition from aircraft to automobile to hotel feel like moving through a single continuous space, rather than navigating a series of discrete public environments. The aircraft themselves were objects of considerable interest. The business jet as a category was still relatively new in those years, and the men who owned or leased them occupied a specific position in the hierarchy of American wealth. Not simply rich, but rich enough and busy enough that the calculation of cost versus time savings had resolved, itself decisively in favour of private aviation. A Lockheed Jetstar or a North American Sabreliner, the most common executive jets of the early 1960s, cost more than most people earned in a lifetime to purchase and required a crew of professional pilots to operate. Owning one was a commitment not just of capital, but of ongoing expense that filtered the population of potential owners to a very small number. The interior of a well-appointed executive jet of that era was designed with the same attention to the specific requirements of wealthy people at rest that characterized the suites they would inhabit at the other end of the journey. The seats were actual chairs, upholstered in leather or fabric of a quality commensurate with the aircraft's price, arranged in configurations that allowed for either private work or social conversation. There was a galley capable of producing simple meals. There was, by the standards of the day, significant comfort, though the cabin noise of those early jets was considerably greater than what later generations of aircraft would achieve, and the experience of flying in them was, by the most honest accounting, somewhat more vigorous than that term suggests. But the noise and the vibration were tolerated, even embraced, as the price of the freedom that private aviation represented. Freedom from schedules, freedom from the managed anonymity of commercial travel, freedom from the particular social experience of being a wealthy and recognizable person in a public space, the careful negotiation of strangers' attention, the management of one's own visibility, the exhausting vigilance that fame or obvious wealth required when moving through the common spaces of the world. On a private aircraft, you could be precisely who you were without performance or management. The crew were professional, trained, discreet. The other passengers were people of your choosing. The schedule was your own. If you wanted to depart at midnight and arrive at dawn and sleep in the sky above the desert, that was possible. If you wanted to stop somewhere unexpected because a conversation had produced an interesting opportunity or a mood had suggested a change of plan, that too could be arranged, subject only to the logistics of aviation and the willingness of the crew to accommodate you. The very wealthy guests who arrived in Las Vegas in those years via private aviation were, by the time they stepped out of their aircraft onto the Nevada tarmac, already in a specific state. the state of a person who has been, for the duration of the journey, in an environment of total personal sovereignty. Nothing had been required of them. Nothing had been beyond their control. The transition to the hotel suite and the casino, and all the carefully managed attentiveness of the Las Vegas luxury experience was, for them, a continuation rather than a contrast. For a smaller number of the very wealthy, those whose resources extended to the genuinely extraordinary, the arrival in Las Vegas was by helicopter. The Desert Inn maintained, on its rooftop, a helipad that allowed certain guests to be transported directly from the airport to the hotel without touching the street at all. This was luxury elevated to its logical conclusion, the complete elimination of all public space from the journey, a private transit from vehicle to accommodation that was unobserved, unshared, and entirely under the control of the arriving guest. Whether or not you arrived by helicopter or by conventional car from the private terminal, the principle was the same. The journey to Las Vegas for the very wealthy was the first act of the performance that the city mounted for its most important visitors. It was designed, like everything else, to communicate a specific thing, that your time was too valuable to be wasted in the ordinary management of public space, that your arrival was an event of sufficient significance to warrant special arrangements, and that the special arrangements had been made with care and with detailed attention to your particular preferences. You were not a passenger. You were not a traveller in the generic sense. You were a specific person whose specific requirements had been specifically anticipated. The desert spread out beneath the descending aircraft, beige and rust and the occasional stark green of an irrigated golf course, looking from above like something improbable and dreamlike, a garden in the middle of nothing, and ahead, already visible even in daylight, the shapes of the hotel towers rising from the valley floor, improbable architecture claiming a landscape that had no prior claim on architectural ambition. Las Vegas from above, approaching it for the first time or the 50th, retained a quality that was difficult to name. It looked impossible. It looked like something that ought not to exist, a city made of pure desire in a landscape that had never asked for cities. It looked, in the particular light of the Nevada desert, almost unreal, a mirage that had somehow solidified, that had acquired concrete and steel and glass and neon, and the dense human infrastructure of a living city, while somehow retaining the quality of the mirage, the quality of something that existed at the intersection of need and imagination, rather than in the ordinary world of cause and effect. You were descending toward it, toward the lights and the music and the service and the gaming rooms, toward the particular experience that only this city in those particular years could provide. Let the aircraft settle gently toward the runway. Let the desert come closer, its textures resolving from abstract impression into specific detail. The individual plants, the shadows of afternoon, the heat shimmer above the asphalt. Let the wheels touch down with the slight shudder that marks the boundary between air and earth. You have arrived. There is a moment in the social life of Las Vegas in those early 1960s years that recurred with enough frequency to be considered a ritual. The moment when a man stepped out of a large, dark American car onto the forecourt of a strip hotel, and the car was immediately taken away by a valet, and a particular kind of attention materialized from nowhere, flowing toward the arrival like water toward a low point. The cars themselves told a story. American luxury automobiles in the early 1960s had reached a particular peak of confident extravagance that later decades would revisit only with nostalgia. The Cadillac Eldorado, the Lincoln Continental, the Imperial, these were large vehicles, genuinely large, built on the assumption that interior space was a luxury in itself, and that the most important people required a great deal of it. They were long and low and finished in colours that the decade had coined, specifically for this purpose. Regal black, glacier white, a particular deep metallic blue that was called something like Adriatic by whoever, had the job of naming automotive colours. The interiors of these cars were automotive luxury at its mid-century peak. Leather seating in colours coordinated with the exterior, instrument panels of genuine wood and chrome, carpeting of the kind that absorbed sound as well as dirt, and produced a particular quality of silence inside the moving vehicle. Air conditioning, still something of a luxury option in those years, still sufficiently novel that its presence was worth noting, kept the interior at a temperature independent of the Nevada heat outside. These were vehicles that announced their occupants before the occupants had emerged. They were read by the people whose job it was to read them, the the valets, the doormen, the casino hosts who maintained positions from which arrivals could be observed, as fluently as text. The make of the car, its condition, its colour, the way it was driven, confidently, without hesitation, as someone who does not need to consider routes or entrances because all routes are open and all entrances are known. All of this was information that directed the quality and speed and warmth of the reception that followed. For those whose resources extended to European automobiles, the statement was different but equally legible. A Rolls-Royce Silver Cloud on the Strip in 1962 was not a common sight, but it was not an unprecedented one, and its appearance communicated something specific, that its occupant's wealth was of a kind, and at a level that had outgrown the American automotive vocabulary and required the language of the old world to express itself. The Rolls was not just expensive, it was a different category of expensive, one that connected its owner, through the chain of cultural association that the brand carried, to a tradition of wealth and taste that predated the American century. The clothes continued the statement that the car had begun. In those years, the suit worn by a wealthy man was still the primary language in which masculine prosperity and taste were expressed. The bespoke suit, made by a tailor who had taken measurements and made a pattern specific to its wearer's body, and created something that could not be purchased off a rack because it was not made for an average body but for a specific one, was the foundation garment of the wealthy man's wardrobe, the piece from which everything else derived its context and meaning. The tailors who made these suits were located in specific places: Savile Row in London, the Via Condotti in Rome, a small number of shops on Madison Avenue and Saks Fifth Avenue that employed craftsmen trained in the European tradition. The process of having a suit made was itself an experience that communicated status. The multiple fittings over weeks or months, the selection of fabric from books of swatches that represented the productions of mills in England and Scotland and Italy whose names were known to no one outside the industry but whose outputs could be distinguished by the people who cared about such distinctions. The result of all this investment and care was a garment that fit its wearer in a way that produced a specific effect. The sense that the clothes had been made not for wearing in general, but for wearing by this specific person in this specific context. The jacket fell correctly across the shoulders, not slightly off as ready-made clothes inevitably do, because its shoulders were his shoulders and no one else's. The trousers broke at exactly the right point on the shoe, because the length had been determined not by a standard, but by a measurement. The whole effect was of a man in complete possession of his presentation, no adjustment required, nothing slightly off, nothing that drew attention to the clothes at the expense of the person wearing them. The shoes completed the picture. Handmade shoes from English or Italian craftsmen, John Lobb, Edward Green, Ferragamo, were recognisable too. Anyone who had worn them or cared about them as something distinct from the machine-made article. They were more comfortable, for one thing, because they had been lasted on forms made to approximate the actual shape of the wearer's feet. Forms that were kept at the maker's shop for the life of the customer's relationship with the firm, and that allowed subsequent pairs to be made without requiring the customer to be present for measurements. They were more durable, and they carried, like the suit, the specific quality of something made for a person rather than for a market. The watches of those years deserve their own consideration. In an era before the smartphone reduced the wristwatch to a social ornament rather than a functional instrument, the watch on the wrist of a wealthy man in 1962 was still doing its primary job, telling time, while simultaneously communicating to anyone who knew how to read it a range of information about its wearer's taste, priorities and means. The major Swiss houses, Patek Philippe, Vacheron Constantin, Alain and Söhne, produced watches of extraordinary technical complexity that were also, by design, visually modest. This modesty was itself the code. The man who wore a watch that contained a perpetual calendar and a minute repeater and a tourbillon, and that cost the equivalent of a new car, was making a statement so subtle that only people who were worth making it to would understand it. Everyone else would see a plain face on a steel or gold case, a watch no more conspicuous than any other. This is one of the central logics of high-end luxury, that the most expensive things are often the least conspicuous to the untrained eye, that the codes of genuine wealth are available only to those already in possession of the knowledge that makes them legible. The flashy, obvious displays of wealth, the objects that announce themselves loudly to anyone who happens to look, are, by this logic, the signals of the newly rich, the people who have not yet learned that the truly wealthy do not need to advertise. Las Vegas occupied an interesting position in relation to this logic. It was a city built on display, on spectacle, on the joyful extravagance of the obvious. The hotels were not subtle, the neon was not coded, the entertainment was not for those who needed to understand arcane references to appreciate it. Las Vegas was, in this sense, democratic in its pleasures. It made no demands on cultural education, and offered its spectacles freely to anyone who could afford the price of admission. And yet the very wealthy guests who came to Las Vegas brought with them the codes of their own world. The bespoke clothes, the precise watches, the correct manner of addressing hotel staff, the particular ease with which they moved through spaces designed for their comfort. They brought the codes of old money and old world taste into a setting that was, in every other respect, aggressively new and aggressively American, and the result was an interesting and productive tension. The casino floor in those years held both types, the man in the bespoke suit with the plain watch, and the quiet manner who lost more in a single evening at baccarat than the flamboyant high roller at the adjacent table lost in a week, and the flamboyant high roller himself, whose success was newer and whose enjoyment of it was more explicitly performed, but whose money was, in the end, exactly as negotiable. Las Vegas in those years welcomed both. It welcomed everyone who could meet the financial requirements of its highest levels, regardless of their cultural origins or the particular vocabulary in which they expressed their prosperity. This too was part of what made the city remarkable, its genuine indifference to the distinctions of origin and background that structured social life everywhere else. Money was the only language Las Vegas required. Everything else was decoration. In the lobby of the Sands, on a warm evening in 1963, the people who gathered before dinner or a show represented a cross-section of American prosperity that would have been difficult to assemble anywhere else. The Texas oil money, and the New York inherited money, and the California new money, and the organized crime money, all dressed to approximately the same standard, all heading toward approximately the same pleasures, all equally served by the same staff with the same quality of attention. It was in its way a great American levelling, not of wealth, the amounts varied enormously, but of access. You could buy your way in, whatever your background, whatever your story, whatever the specific geography of your fortune. The desert accepted everyone who arrived with the price of admission, and the light stayed on for all of them, equally, without judgment. There is a time, in the rhythm of a Las Vegas night, that exists in the space between the late shows and the small hours of the morning, a time when the most crowded and social city in America achieves, in certain of its private spaces, a quality that can only be described as solitude. It is around 3 a.m. The final show of the evening has ended. The gaming rooms continue, as they always continue, with the particular reduced gravity sound of fewer people in a large space. The chips and cards and the quiet conversations of the committed, the ones who have passed through the festive hours of peak evening into something quieter and more private. But the public spaces, the lobbies, the restaurants, the bars, have largely cleared, and the pool at this hour is empty. The pool of a major strip hotel at 3 a.m. is a different thing from the pool of the same hotel at 3 p.m. During the day it's a social space, frequented by people in swimwear who are aware of being seen and who arrange themselves accordingly. The service is continuous, the conversation is audible from any point in the area, the mood is collective. The particular mood of a group of people engaged in the shared activity of being comfortable and attractive in a sunny place. At 3 a.m, the pool lights come from below the water, casting an upward glow that transforms the surface of the pool into something that looks almost organic, as if it is generating its own cool blue light, rather than merely reflecting it. The underwater lights were relatively new technology in those years, still sufficiently unusual that their effect was genuinely striking rather than familiar. The pool glowed from within. Above it, the Nevada sky was spread in its full amplitude. The stars that the city's lights reduced to near invisibility from most vantage points were, at the pool's edge, somewhat more present, the Milky Way faintly discernible, if you positioned yourself with your back to the hotel's lit exterior. A wealthy guest who found himself at the pool at this hour would have walked through the nearly empty corridors of the hotel to reach it, his footsteps absorbed by the thick carpeting that ran even into the service corridors of the premium floor. He might have passed a housekeeper moving quietly through the late hours, a cart of fresh linens, a maintenance person checking something that required checking at this hour. They would have acknowledged each other with the minimal interaction that the hotel's culture of discretion prescribed. A slight nod, a maintained pace, the mutual recognition of people who inhabit the same space on different terms. At the pool, he might have settled into one of the chaises longues, still there, still set out for use even at this hour, because the hotel's operating logic required that all amenities remain available throughout the night in case any guests should want them. The towels were fresh, restocked during the late evening. The bar service was available, though at this hour it meant waiting for the bartender assigned to late pool service, who would appear within a few minutes of being wanted and who would provide whatever was asked without comment or apparent inconvenience. What would he feel, this wealthy man, alone at the pool of his hotel at 3 a.m. in Las Vegas? Something that was perhaps difficult to feel anywhere else, a quality of being genuinely outside of time, not the artificial timelessness of the casino floor, which manufactured its suspension of normal rhythms through deliberate design, but something more organic, the genuine stillness that the desert always produces when you stop long enough to let it in. The Nevada desert is old beyond ordinary human comprehension. The mountains visible in 3 directions from the valley floor are old in a way that the word old only begins to describe, formed through geological processes that operated over timescales that dwarf the entire human story, shaped by forces that preceded life itself. The valley is old, the sky is old. The stars above it are older still, their light having travelled for intervals of time that the human mind cannot actually hold, arriving at this pool on this night as photons that began their journeys before the Earth existed. And here, in the middle of all this antiquity, a swimming pool lit from below with electric light, constructed a few years ago by workers who have moved on to other projects, surrounded by a hotel that will be demolished and replaced within the century. A man in a bathrobe with a glass of whiskey, in a city that did not exist in any meaningful sense 30 years ago, and that will not exist in its current form 30 years hence. The impermanence was part of the experience, for those who could feel it. Las Vegas never pretended to be permanent. It was built fast, and it knew it had been built fast, and it wore its impermanence with a certain openness. Nothing here was meant to last forever. Everything was meant to be spectacular now, in this moment, under these lights for these particular people who had made the choice to be here. There was something almost Buddhist about it if you squinted at it from the right angle. The city's entire philosophy was presence. Be here, now. Engage with this moment fully. Don't hold back. Don't save yourself. Don't calculate the future cost of your current pleasure. The present is where the chips are and the lights are and the music is. The present is where Sinatra is singing and the cards are turning and the whiskey is correctly cold. At the pool, at 3 a.m, with the desert stars overhead and the blue-lit water below and the warm Nevada night pressing gently on all sides, this philosophy achieved its purest expression. Nothing was required. Nothing was happening. Nothing needed to happen. The stars were turning on their ancient axes. The water was still. The air smelled of sage and chlorine and the very faint residue of the cigarette smoke that drifted from somewhere inside the hotel. It was a perfect moment. Not dramatic, not spectacular, not the kind of moment that makes good copy in a gossip column or good material for a story told over dinner. Just a perfect moment. The kind that arrives without announcement and departs without ceremony, and that is in the leaving recognised as having been perfect. The glass held its whiskey, the stars held their positions, the water held its light, and the man in the bathrobe held very still, aware that something was happening that was worth being aware of. In the morning he would gamble, in the afternoon he would play golf. Tomorrow night there would be a show and a dinner and the social performance that the Strip demanded from its participants. But now, at 3 a.m, at the edge of the lit pool under the ancient Nevada sky, there was nothing to perform. There was only this, which was, in the end, enough. Let the image settle like the pool water after the last ripple has crossed it. Let it hold still. Let it. Reflect the stars and the lights with equal fidelity, making no distinction between the ancient and the new, the natural and the manufactured, the permanent and the temporary. Everything belongs to the same night. The story of Las Vegas in the early 1960s, told most often as a story about men, the gamblers, the performers, the hotel operators, the organised crime figures who funded the construction, is incomplete without its women. Not the showgirls and cocktail waitresses who populated the public imagery of the Strip, though they are part of the story too, But the women who came as companions to the wealthy, who navigated the specific social world of the Strip's highest echelons, and who often found in Las Vegas an environment that was simultaneously more and less constrained than the worlds they came from. A wealthy wife in America in 1962 occupied a specific social position whose requirements and limitations were more clearly defined than almost any other role in the culture. She managed a household, or more precisely, she managed the staff who managed the household. She appeared in public in specific context: the charity board, the club dinner, the dinner party, with the precise hierarchy of who was invited and in what order, with a consistency and reliability that reflected on her husband's standing. She dressed appropriately for each context. She conversed appropriately. She presented a version of herself that was polished and controlled and thoroughly socially calibrated. Las Vegas in those years was not quite one of those specific contexts. It was something slightly outside the normal social geography of American upper-class life, a destination that was acceptable for people of means to visit, but that was not, in the way that Palm Beach or Southampton or Newport were, a place where the full weight of social obligation applied. You could, in Las Vegas, relax certain performances that were non-negotiable elsewhere. You could go to the midnight show in your good jewelry and stay until 2 a.m, and drink more than you might at home, and dance with your husband in the way that the Copa room encouraged, and that you would not do at the club dinner at home. This relative relaxation of constraint was, for many wealthy women, one of Las Vegas's most genuine pleasures. Not the gambling necessarily, though many of them gambled with real enthusiasm and occasionally with real skill. Not the shows, though the shows were spectacular, but the feeling of being, for a few days, in a place where the ordinary rules were suspended and where pleasure was not merely permitted but explicitly encouraged. The shopping, too, was part of it. Las Vegas in those years had developed, in the hotels and in the adjacent streets, a retail environment specifically designed for people who spent money easily and who expected the merchandise to be worthy of their interest. The jewelry stores that occupied positions in the major hotels were not generic jewelers, but establishments whose inventory reflected the tastes and financial capacities of their clientele, pieces that would have been at home in the windows of the major jewelry houses in New York and Paris, presented in settings that allowed them to be examined at leisure by people who had the knowledge and the means to appreciate them. A wealthy woman in a Las Vegas hotel jewelry store in those years was doing something more than shopping. She was engaged in an activity that was simultaneously practical and social and aesthetic, examining pieces that might become part of her jewelry collection, that would appear at future social occasions, that would communicate something specific about her taste and her husband's generosity, that were themselves objects of genuine beauty requiring genuine knowledge to fully appreciate. The most significant jewelry purchases in Las Vegas in those years were not impulse buys. They were the results of conversations and considerations that might span multiple visits, that involved consultation with the jeweler about specific stones and settings, that reflected genuine connoisseurship rather than mere expenditure. A woman who bought a significant sapphire in Las Vegas in 1962 had probably been looking for a sapphire of that particular quality for some time, and the Las Vegas jeweler who had stocked it had done so because he understood his market well enough to know that the people who came to his store were looking for specific things and would recognize and respond to them. But not all of the women who moved through the social world of the Strip in those years were wives. The celebrity culture that Las Vegas generated in those years, the Rat Pack culture, the world of movie stars and entertainment industry figures who gathered in the Copa room and the gaming rooms and the after-hours parties, had its own demographics of companionship, its own cast of women whose relationship to the men they accompanied was more complex and less clearly defined than the institution of marriage provided for. These women navigated a social world that was, in some respects, more interesting than the one defined by marriage. They were often women of genuine talent and achievement in their own right, actresses, singers, socialites with their own reputations and their own social standing. They were not dependent on their male companions for identity or position in the way that the conventional wife role prescribed. They had chosen their presence in Las Vegas as they had chosen the rest of their lives, with agency and with the particular freedom that came from having enough of their own resources, financial or social or both, to make genuine choices. The social world of the Strip was, in this regard, somewhat more egalitarian in terms of gender than the conventional American upper-class world it existed alongside. A woman at the gaming table in Las Vegas in those years was a normal sight, not a curiosity or an exception. A woman at the bar, alone or with female companions rather than accompanied by a man, was not subject to the social implications that would have attended such a scene in other contexts. The casino floor was, in its fundamental logic, a space where the only relevant distinction was between those who were gambling and those who were not, and women who gambled were in every respect participants on the same terms as men. This relative openness was genuine, if limited. The highest echelons of power in Las Vegas in those years, the casino owners, the mob figures, the major hotel operators, were almost exclusively male, and the decisions that shaped the city's character were made in rooms to which women were rarely admitted. The relative freedom of the casino floor and the showroom existed within structures of ownership and control that were as thoroughly gendered as anywhere else in American business life. But for the women who came to Las Vegas as guests of those structures, rather than participants in them, there was a quality of latitude that the city provided that was genuine and that many of them valued. The strict social regulation of upper-class American life in those years, the precise expectations about how a woman of position should present and conduct herself in every conceivable social context, was, in Las Vegas, somewhat loosened. Not eliminated, not overturned, but loosened enough to let something breathe that was otherwise kept carefully contained. The Copa Room at midnight, with the music playing and the champagne poured, and the performers on the stage fully inhabiting their extraordinary talents. In this room, for a few hours, the categories of wife and companion and celebrity and socialite collapsed into something simpler and more human. People were having a good time together, the desert was dark outside, the music went on, every stay in Las Vegas ends. This is the fundamental fact that the casino and hotel industry works hard at every level of its operation to defer, to push back, to make the moment of departure feel, when it finally arrives, like a gentle easing rather than an abrupt transition. But it arrives nonetheless. The car is called for. The luggage is brought down from the suite by staff who have learned to perform this service with the same careful invisibility that characterized all their other interactions with this particular guest. The suite, which has been home for a week or 2 weeks or a month, reverts almost immediately to its institutional character. The flowers will be removed, the particular bottles restocked to their standard positions, the bed remade to its standard configuration rather than the specific variation this guest preferred. The checkout process, for a high-roller guest, was not a checkout in the conventional sense. There was no standing at a front desk with a bill, no review of charges, no presentation of a credit card. The financial arrangements were handled with the same discretion that characterized everything else. Through conversations between hotel management and the personal assistants or business managers who handled the practical finances of serious wealth, through accounts that were maintained and settled through channels that the guest himself might never directly engage with. What the guest experienced was a farewell, a specific, warm, personalized farewell from the people whose job it had been to attend to him during his stay, conducted at whatever level of formality felt appropriate to the relationship that had developed over the course of his time there. The casino host, the concierge who had arranged the particular things that needed arranging, perhaps the hotel manager himself for guests of sufficient commercial importance. These farewells were not purely transactional, though they were certainly commercial. The relationships that formed between the high-roller guests and the hotel staff who served them in those years had the particular quality of genuine human connection that can develop in situations where one person is consistently helpful to another over an extended period in conditions of unusual intensity. You had been in this person's care for a week. They had seen you in states of excitement and in states of exhaustion. They had attended to your needs when those needs were mundane and when they were specific and unusual. They had, in some meaningful sense, known you in the way that service at this level requires knowing the person served. The farewell acknowledged this, not explicitly, not with the language of intimacy that would have been inappropriate, but with the specific warmth that a genuine relationship, however professionally structured, produces when it is temporarily suspended. "We look forward to your return" was the standard phrase, and it was meant. The return of a high-roller guest was a commercial event of genuine significance. The casino had an interest in making the farewell warm enough that the return was motivated and anticipated. But more than that, and this is the human element that commercial analysis sometimes misses, the people who had spent a week attending to this particular person had developed over the course of that week the particular form of investment in another person's well-being that attentive service produces. They had been responsible for his comfort and his pleasure. They had met his standards. He was leaving having been well served, and there was in that a professional satisfaction that went beyond the commercial. The car pulled away from the hotel's private entrance. The strip, in the daylight of morning, looked different from the strip of the night before. Smaller somehow, its scale more comprehensible in ordinary light than it was in the dramatic illumination of darkness. The neon was off. The crowds were sparse. A maintenance crew was working on a section of the forecourt that would be immaculate by evening. The desert on either side of the boulevard looked as it always looked, ancient and indifferent and beautiful in the particular way that the Mojave is beautiful. Not a beauty that courts attention, but one that simply exists, that was there before anything else and will be there after everything else, that requires nothing from the people who drive through it, or fly over it, or build improbable cities in its valleys. The wealthy guest, riding in the back of his car toward the airport or the private terminal, with the sense of a very specific week behind him and the sense of his ordinary life ahead, was in a transitional state that many people who have come back from exceptional experiences will recognize. Something had happened. Something had been experienced that was, by the standards of ordinary life, extraordinary. A week of being attended to at a level of care that most humans never receive, of gambling sums that most humans never possess, of watching performers who will be remembered long after most of what happens in Las Vegas is forgotten, of moving through a world that was designed, in every particular, to meet him exactly where he was. And now it was over. He was on his way back to the life that ordinary life required of him, the decisions and the pressures and the relationships and the obligations that wealth could moderate but not eliminate, the vast apparatus of a consequential life that had been running in his absence and that was waiting for his attention. Las Vegas, receding in the rear window of the car, made no emotional demands on its departing guests. It did not ask to be mourned or missed. It simply continued, the hotel still there, the neon dark for now but ready to come to life again at dusk, the desert unchanged and unchanging around it, waiting with the particular patience of a place that knows exactly what it is and knows that you will be back. You would be back, because Las Vegas, in those years, did something to people that was difficult to explain and easy to understand. It gave them, for the duration of their stay, the feeling of being entirely themselves, without apology or management, in conditions of maximum comfort and minimum obligation. And that feeling, which is in some essential way the feeling of being deeply and specifically cared for, was addictive in the most literal sense. Not the gambling. The gambling was the mechanism. The feeling was the product. The desert received the departing car and the city continued, and the morning light fell across everything without distinction, across the hotels and the neon and the parking lots and the sage and the mountains, exactly as it had fallen that morning and the morning before and every morning since the first morning. Persistent and warm and entirely unaware that anything had been happening here worth remembering, though it had, though everything had, and somewhere in the memory of a man on his way back to the ordinary world, Las Vegas was already beginning to glow, the way things glow in memory when they have been genuinely experienced. Not the cold glow of photographs and records, but the warm glow of something that was lived, that involved the body and the senses and the emotions, that left a mark not in the external world but in the interior one. The neon in the mind, warm, persistent, entirely itself. Let it glow there as you breathe. Let your body settle towards sleep the way the desert settles toward night, gradually, without resistance, accepting the quiet as something given rather than something taken. The lights are dimming, in the mind, in the room, in the desert memory that is your own tonight. Let them dim. Let yourself go. Las Vegas is out there, somewhere, still lit, still turning, still waiting with its particular patience for whoever arrives next and needs what it has always had to offer. But you are here, in the quiet, in the dark, in the warmth of everything that has been remembered tonight, and that is enough. That is more than enough. Sleep now. There is something the desert knows that cities forget. The desert knows how to wait. It has been waiting longer than the concept of waiting has existed. Before there were creatures who could measure the passing of time, The desert was already doing what it does, enduring, shifting infinitesimally slowly, holding the heat of the day in its stones and releasing it into the night air long after the sun has gone. Las Vegas grew up on top of the desert without fully displacing it. The desert was always there at the edges, patient, vast, entirely indifferent to the human drama playing out above its surface. The hotels and the neon and the roads and the parking lots covered some of the desert. They could not cover all of it, and what they covered did not cease being desert simply because something had been placed on top of it. Beneath the asphalt, beneath the concrete foundations of the hotels, the desert was there, unchanged, waiting. This knowledge, which every Las Vegas resident carried in some part of themselves, even when they were deepest in the city's rhythms, gave the place a quality that was difficult to name but immediately felt. A humility, perhaps, or rather, an awareness of scale. The awareness that the human drama unfolding on the Strip was enormous by human standards, and entirely irrelevant by the standards of the landscape that contained it. The wealthy guests who came to Las Vegas in those years were people who had, by definition, achieved significant things by human standards. They had accumulated resources that placed them far above most of their fellow creatures in any measurement that human societies use to measure such things. They were important. Their decisions affected other people. Their comfort was attended to. Their preferences were recorded and honoured. And yet, standing at the window of the penthouse suite at 4 in the morning, looking out across the desert to where the mountains were dark shapes against a sky full of stars, you could feel, if you were paying attention, the presence of the desert's patience. The mountains did not care. The stars had been shining for time periods that made the concept of caring inapplicable. The sage and the sand and the slow geology of the valley floor continued their ancient processes unmoved by the proximity of a 5,000 square foot suite containing a man of consequence. This was, in its way, a gift, not a rebuke. The desert was not interested in rebuking anyone, but a perspective, a reminder received not as lecture but as simple fact, that the scale of human importance was a very small scale indeed, and that existing at the top of that scale was a remarkable achievement, and also, in the largest possible frame, a relatively modest one. Some people found this thought disturbing, some found it comforting. The wealthy man at the window of his suite at 4 in the morning in Las Vegas was not, typically, a man who had much occasion in his ordinary life to think about the scale of things beyond the human. Las Vegas, with its desert at the edges and its stars above the neon, occasionally provided the occasion whether or not it was sought. The chips had been gathered or lost. The show had ended. The dinner had been eaten. The wine had been drunk, the music had faded, and the performers had retired to their own suites. The social performance of the evening was over, and what remained was this: a man, a window, a desert, a sky full of ancient light. It was enough to make you breathe differently, more slowly, more deliberately. The kind of breathing that happens when the body recognizes that it has reached a still point and allows itself for a moment to simply be still. The desert breathed too, in its own way. The barely perceptible movement of air across the valley floor, carrying the smell of sage and mineral dust and the coolness that the desert releases from its stones after dark, the breath of something enormous and ancient circulating through a landscape that had been circulating it long before anyone thought to put a casino here. You could breathe with it if you let yourself. Match your own rhythm to the rhythm of something much larger than yourself. Feel, just for a moment, the strange comfort of being very small in a very large thing, and finding that very large thing generous enough to contain you without comment. The stars turned. The desert held its warmth and released it. The city glowed and hummed with its impossible energy. And at the window, a man breathed slowly, in and out, feeling something it would take him days to find words for. Let that breathing be yours now, slow and full and entirely without effort. The city is out there, brilliant and alive. The desert is out there, patient and ancient. You are here, between them, held by both, belonging to neither, free. One of the peculiarities of Las Vegas as a destination for seriously wealthy men in those years was that it required them to be, in some meaningful sense, away. Not gone, exactly. The telephone followed them, and the major hotels were expert at managing the practical communications of business lives that could not simply pause for the duration of a vacation. But there was a quality of removal about Las Vegas, a sense that the city occupied a different temporal register from the ordinary world of commerce and obligation that made the business of staying connected a different kind of task than it was at home. The telephone in those years was both the primary instrument of business communication and a much more limited one than what the word now conjures. A long-distance call required going through an operator. A call to another country, not common, but not impossible for a man of sufficient means with sufficient reason to make one, required navigating time zone differences and international exchange systems that were considerably less reliable than the domestic network. The call, when it connected, carried with it a particular quality of effort that underlined the distance being bridged. The major strip hotels in those years employed telephone operators around the clock whose specific skill was the management of long-distance calls for guests whose business might require connection to any part of the country at any hour. These operators knew, in the way that all Las Vegas hotel staff knew everything relevant about the important guests in their care, which calls were expected, and which were emergencies, and which were to be routed directly through, regardless of the hour, and which could wait until the guest had risen. A wealthy man on a week-long stay in Las Vegas in 1962 did not disappear from his business life. He remained accessible. His office knew the number of his suite, his associates could reach him, his lawyers and bankers and investment managers had been briefed on his whereabouts and on the arrangements for reaching him when necessary. But the reaching required effort from the caller, and that effort constituted a kind of filter. Only genuinely important matters made it through, because only genuinely important matters justified the trouble of placing a long-distance call to a man who was, by general understanding, on something like a holiday. This filtering was itself a luxury. The man at home, even the very wealthy man at home in his office or his study, was accessible in a way that made truly trivial matters almost as intrusive as genuinely important ones, because the cost of reaching him was so low that the threshold for attempting contact was correspondingly minimal. In Las Vegas, that threshold was raised by simple geography and the mild friction of the telephone system of the era, and what the raising of the threshold produced was a quality of selective availability that most people could not achieve in their ordinary lives. The telegram was another instrument of the era, and the major Las Vegas hotels maintained telegram services that allowed messages to be sent and received around the clock. The telegram had a certain gravity that the telephone call sometimes lacked. It required the composition of a message in written form. It imposed a cost per word that encouraged concision, and it arrived as a physical document rather than a disembodied voice, lending the communication a permanence that telephone conversations did not possess. Telegrams in those years were still used for genuinely significant communications. Business transactions confirmed, agreements acknowledged, urgent matters requiring immediate response. The hotel's telegram service meant that such communications could reach a guest without interrupting whatever he was engaged in at the moment, could be reviewed at his leisure and responded to on his own schedule, could be filed away in the suite's writing desk for later reference or forwarded to his office for action by his staff. The writing desk was a feature of every serious hotel suite in those years, and it was not merely decorative, it was a working space, equipped with the hotel's stationery and envelopes, with a supply of stamps, with the specific implements of correspondence, good pens, decent ink, blotting paper. Men of the generation that used Las Vegas in those years had been educated in a tradition of written correspondence that had not yet been entirely displaced by the telephone, and the ability to produce a handwritten letter remained a social skill of genuine importance. A letter written from the suite of a Las Vegas hotel had a specific character. It carried, in its handwriting and its stationery and its postmark, the information that its author was in Las Vegas, which told its recipient something about the author's circumstances and activities and resources. The stationery of the major strip hotels was itself a communication, elegant, specific, immediately identifiable to anyone who knew what it represented. The management of a wealthy man's correspondence during a Las Vegas stay was typically divided between his own direct communications and those handled by his personal secretary or assistant, who might be travelling with him, or might be managing matters remotely from a home office. The division of labour reflected the hierarchy of communication. Truly personal letters were written by hand from the writing desk. Business correspondence was dictated, transcribed, reviewed and signed. Purely administrative matters were handled entirely by staff without the principal's involvement. This delegation of correspondence was itself a form of luxury, and it required the creation and maintenance of the kind of staff relationships that made such delegation possible. A personal secretary who truly understood her employer's correspondence, who knew which relationships required personal attention and which could be managed at arm's length, who understood the political geography of his business relationships and the personal geography of his social ones, was not merely a practical convenience but a person of genuine value, someone whose competence and discretion were worth considerably more than her salary. The specific quiet of a Las Vegas hotel suite in the late morning, when the correspondence had been dispatched and the calls returned and the telegrams answered, was a specific kind of quiet. The business of the day had been conducted, or at least initiated. The afternoon lay ahead with its pool and its golf and its pleasant vacancy. The evening lay further ahead with its dinner and its show and its gaming and its social pleasures. Between the morning's correspondence and the afternoon's recreation was a brief window, an hour, perhaps, sometimes less, in which nothing was required. The papers had been reviewed, the messages had been sent. The hotel was doing its invisible work of maintaining the comfort and convenience of its guest. The Nevada sun was warming the desert outside the blackout curtains. In that window, if you were paying attention, you could feel it. The particular quality of being entirely between one obligation and the next, unoccupied not by accident but by design, resting in the space between the morning's duties and the afternoon's pleasures, with nothing to fill it but your own presence. It was a small thing, by the standards of all the large things that Las Vegas provided, but it was, in its way, the most precise expression of what extraordinary wealth could purchase. Not the suite, not the food, not the entertainment, but this. The 10 minutes of sitting quietly in a comfortable chair with nothing required of you, surrounded by evidence that everything has been attended to, in a room designed for your specific comfort, in a city that exists primarily to ensure that you're not disturbed, just sitting, just breathing, just being without audience or obligation for a few minutes in the middle of a day that would otherwise be full. Let that image sit with you now, the quiet suite, the morning light behind the curtains, the sense of all correspondence dispatched and all obligations temporarily met. The afternoon waiting at a comfortable distance, unhurried, offering nothing except the possibility of pleasure. Let your breathing slow to match it, the quiet, the stillness, the sense that nothing is required of you right now, in this moment, except to be here. Every luxury that has been described in this story, the suite, the food, the personalized attention, the anticipation of preferences, the sense of being known and cared for, was produced by people, not by systems or machines or the impersonal efficiency of institutional management, but by specific human beings who arrived for their shifts and took up their positions and performed, with skill and with the particular dignity that genuine professional competence produces, the work of making other people comfortable. The service staff of the major Las Vegas hotels in the early 1960s were a specific population, drawn from specific backgrounds, trained in specific ways, and occupying a specific position in the social and economic landscape of the city. Understanding who they were and how their work was organized tells you something important about how the luxury they produced was actually constructed, what it required, what it cost, what it meant. The housekeeping staff formed the largest single component of the hotel's labor force, though they were the least visible to guests. They moved through the occupied floors of the hotel during the hours of daytime and early afternoon, entering rooms that guests had temporarily vacated, performing the work of transformation that luxury hotels require, the complete restoration of a living space to its pristine initial state, accomplished so efficiently and so invisibly that the guest returning to their room encountered what appeared to be a space that had never been occupied rather than one that had been restored to appearance of that condition. The standards for this work were exacting, not merely clean but precisely arranged, the towels folded in the specific way that the hotel standards prescribed, the amenities placed in the specific positions that the hotel standards specified, the bed made to the specific tightness and alignment that distinguished the hotel's presentation from the merely adequate. A housekeeper who met these standards did so with the efficiency that comes from deep practice, each room completed in a specific time, each element attended to in a specific sequence, nothing left to improvisation. The housekeepers of the strip hotels in those years were drawn largely from Las Vegas's established working-class population, the women who had arrived with the city's early growth in the 1940s and 1950s, and who had built their lives around the hotel economy that was the primary employer of the valley. Many of them had been doing this work for a decade or more. Many of them knew specific hotels more intimately than any guest ever would, knew which rooms were difficult to clean, which fixtures were unreliable, which guests were considerate and which were not, which of the invisible systems that maintained the hotel's functioning were operating well and which required ongoing improvisation. The personal valets and butlers who served the high-roller suites were a different category of staff, smaller in number, specifically selected and specifically trained, performing a kind of service whose requirements were more complex and more personal than the maintenance of rooms in general. A suite butler in a major Las Vegas hotel in those years was expected to function as a combination of personal assistant, wardrobe manager, social secretary, and the specific kind of companion that wealthy people have always required for their most private hours. Someone who is present without demanding to be noticed, helpful without being servile, knowledgeable without exhibiting that knowledge unless it was specifically called upon. The training for this kind of service was not formalized in the way that professional education generally was in those years. It was transmitted through practice and observation, through the specific relationship of mentorship that forms between experienced service professionals and their successors, through the accumulated institutional knowledge of an establishment that had been learning, through each guest and each interaction, what its most important customers required. The casino dealers occupied a different position in the service hierarchy. They were in a sense the most visible of the service staff, present at the gaming tables for the full duration of their shifts, engaged in direct interaction with guests of every variety. Their work required a specific combination of skills: the mechanical, precision to deal cards and calculate results without error at a speed that kept the game moving at the pace the players expected; the social acuity to read the mood of the table and adapt their manner accordingly; the specific emotional regulation that allowed them to witness large financial transactions, wins and losses of amounts that dwarfed their own salaries, without allowing those transactions to register on their faces or in their behavior. The emotional regulation required of a Las Vegas casino dealer in those years was genuinely demanding. A dealer at a high-stakes baccarat table might witness, in the course of a single shift, the transfer of sums of money that would take them decades to earn. They might watch a player lose what appeared to be equanimity, maintain, or fail to maintain, composure in the face of significant financial disappointment. They might be the recipients of significant gratuities from grateful winners or the targets of displaced frustration from disappointed losers. All of this required the ability to remain, functionally, neutral, engaged enough to provide good service, detached enough to be unaffected by the emotional content of the interactions they were part of. The cocktail servers who moved through the gaming rooms deserved specific consideration, because their work was in many respects the most complex of all the service roles. They were simultaneously performing the mechanical function of delivering drinks, the social function of maintaining the pleasant atmosphere of the gaming floor, and the commercial function of ensuring that the hotel's investment in complimentary beverages produced the intended effect of keeping players comfortable and in their seats. In those years, the cocktail servers in Las Vegas casinos were almost uniformly women, dressed in the specific uniform that each casino had specified, moving through the gaming floor on schedules that were timed to ensure that no player at any table went without an opportunity to order a drink for longer than was comfortable. The management of these routes required an understanding of the gaming floor as a physical space, which tables were busy, which were slow, which players were on hot streaks and therefore in an expansive mood, which were on cold streaks and therefore in need of careful handling. The tips that the service staff of the major hotels received were, in the aggregate, a significant supplement to their base wages and an important part of the economic logic that made Las Vegas work for the people who lived and worked there, as well as for the wealthy guests who visited. A cocktail server on a busy Friday night at the Sands, working the high-stakes section of the gaming floor, might receive in tips an amount that compared favourably with her base weekly wage. A sweet butler who had served a particularly satisfied high roller for a week-long stay might receive a gratuity that represented several weeks of his salary. This, dependence on tips, created a specific relationship between service quality and economic reward that was, in its logic, different from the salaried arrangements of most other industries. The service staff of the strip hotels were, in a direct and personal way, compensated for quality. A guest who had been excellently served and who had enjoyed his stay left a larger gratuity than one who had been adequately served and had had an ordinary experience. This created an incentive structure that, when it worked well, aligned the interests of the service staff with the interests of the guests in a way that produced genuinely excellent service. Not because the hotel required it in the abstract, but because the individual server or butler or dealer had a direct personal interest in the quality of the guest's experience. The people who performed these roles with genuine excellence, and there were many of them in those hotels in those years, were practicing something that deserved to be called an art form, even if the culture of the time would not have used that language about domestic and service work. The ability to anticipate a need before it was expressed, to read the mood of a room or a table or a guest with accuracy and respond to it appropriately, to remain present and attentive throughout a long shift without the quality of presence declining. This required skill, practice, and a specific kind of intelligence that the world does not always recognize with the respect it deserves. The luxury that the very wealthy guests of Las Vegas experienced in those years was not produced by money alone. Money provided the materials, the marble and the Egyptian cotton, and the crystalware, and the wine from the correct region of France. But the luxury itself was produced by people, by the specific human beings who changed the flowers every day, and folded the towels in the correct way, and delivered the coffee at the right temperature and remembered that you preferred your morning newspaper folded a certain way, and that you liked the curtains open by a precise 12 inches at 8 o'clock. That human dimension, the specific knowledge and care and skill of the people whose work was every moment the invisible architecture of the luxury that surrounded you, was perhaps the most genuinely valuable thing that the very wealthy purchased when they came to Las Vegas. Not the suite, not the show, not the game. The people who made it all work and who did so with a quality of attention that the money made possible but did not by itself guarantee. Let that thought be with you in the quiet of your own rest. Someone, somewhere, is attending to something. Some invisible care is being taken. Some small and ordinary act of maintenance or preparation is happening in the background of your life, unobserved and uncelebrated, making the next moment a little more comfortable than it would otherwise be. That quiet attention is everywhere. It is the texture of a world that mostly works, mostly provides, mostly holds you without your having to ask it to. Let yourself be held by it. There is a specific moment in the life of every Las Vegas night when the balance tips. It happens in the hour before dawn, when the darkness of the desert sky begins to differentiate, the east going from black to the faintest possible purple, to an almost imperceptible lightening that is less a colour than the absence of the complete dark that preceded it. The stars are still there, but the brightest ones are beginning to lose their edge. The air has reached its coolest point of the night, the cold that the desert always accumulates in the small hours, and it hangs motionless over the valley, caught between the warmth it has released from the ground and the warmth that the coming sun will soon begin to restore. At this hour, the Strip's neon reaches a specific point in its nightly existence. The signs themselves are still burning. They are always burning. The maintenance crews replace tubes that have failed and ensure that the spectacle continues uninterrupted. But the darkness against which they blazed all evening is beginning to recede. Against the developing light of the eastern sky, the neon is entering its transitional period. Neither the brilliant night spectacle it was at midnight, nor the ordinary daytime infrastructure it will be by 8 in the morning. It is something in between, still luminous, still asserting its presence, but the surrounding world is gradually withdrawing the contrast that made it most vivid. The people who witness this moment are few. Most of the Strip's visitors are asleep by this hour, the late-night energy of even the most committed reveller having eventually given way to the body's patient insistence on rest. The gaming rooms are at their emptiest, though never empty. The committed remain, the ones for whom the hour is irrelevant, whose relationship with the game has suspended the normal rhythms of day and night. The service workers who populate the hotel's overnight hours are at this moment in the later portion of their shifts. The housekeeper who will turn over the occupied rooms when their guests have risen, the kitchen staff who are beginning the first preparations for the breakfast service that will begin in a few hours, the maintenance personnel who conduct their rounds with a quiet efficiency that the daytime requires to be invisible and the nighttime makes possible. Outside, on the Strip itself, the traffic is at its most sparse, a delivery truck making its rounds to the hotel kitchens, a taxicab taking someone to the airport for an early flight, the street cleaners that the city dispatches in the small hours to prepare the public spaces for the day ahead, moving slowly along the boulevard with their brushes and their water jets, erasing the evidence of the previous night's occupation. Las Vegas cleans itself in the dark. By the time the morning sun has fully risen and the first wave of daytime activity has begun, the strip will look essentially as it looked at the beginning of the previous evening. The sidewalks clean, the forecourts tidy, the evidence of the thousands of people who passed through this landscape in the preceding 12 hours reduced to invisibility by the overnight crew, whose job is exactly this: the maintenance of the fiction that the city is always at its beginning, always fresh, always presenting itself as if for the first time. In the hotel kitchens, the first loaves of bread for the breakfast service are going into the ovens. The smell of baking bread in a large commercial kitchen at 5 in the morning is one of the most genuinely comforting smells in the world. Warm, yeasty, rich with the specific complexity that leavened dough acquires during a long rise, the product of living organisms doing their patient biological work in the warm darkness of proofing chambers that have been running since the previous night. The pastry cooks are already at work, producing the croissants and the Danish and the specific preparations that distinguish a serious hotel breakfast from an ordinary one. This work requires time. The laminated doughs that produce croissants need to rest between the stages of their construction, and the resting cannot be hurried, so the pastry preparation always begins long before the breakfast service will open, in the quiet early hours when the kitchen is occupied only by the early shift, and the smells of their work drift through the service corridors and occasionally, through some improbable alchemy of ventilation and architecture, reach the upper floors where the guests are sleeping. In the suite on the upper floor, the occupant is asleep. The blackout curtains are doing their work, keeping the developing desert dawn from intruding on the sleep that is still, at 5 in the morning, proceeding with the depth that serious tiredness and genuine comfort produce. When they are combined, the coffee that will be brought at whatever hour has been specified is prepared but not yet brewed. The morning newspaper, the correct papers, obtained through arrangements made well in advance, is waiting in the hotel's mailroom to be delivered at the appropriate moment. The suite is quiet in the particular way that a well-built room is quiet at this hour. Not the silence of emptiness, which has a slightly hollow quality, but the silence of a space that contains someone asleep. A warm and inhabited silence that is alive in a specific way. The refrigerated air moves through the room with a barely perceptible circulation. The building itself, that enormous structure of concrete and steel and glass, sits on its foundations with the settled weight of something that has found its equilibrium and is at rest. Outside, the sky continues its patient transformation. The purple deepens briefly, then begins to warm, the first suggestion of orange appearing at the horizon above the spring mountains, the sky moving through its morning vocabulary with the unhurried deliberateness of astronomical processes that have been proceeding for 4 billion years and that find the concept of hurry entirely irrelevant. The neon is still burning. It will burn for another hour, diminishing gradually in relative brilliance as the sky brightens around it, until sometime around 7 o'clock, when the light has become sufficient that the signs are simply large structures on the buildings rather than sources of illumination in their own right. At that point, depending on the specific management of each property, some of the signs will be extinguished, their work for the night completed, their tubes allowed to cool, the electrical circuits opened until the evening comes again and calls for their specific contribution to the city's characteristic spectacle. But for now, in this specific hour between night and day, the neon continues its patient burning. It has burned all night. It will burn until the day no longer needs it. It does not consider the effort of its burning, does not mark the hours of its operation, does not distinguish between the moments of its greatest visibility and the moments when the brightening world diminishes its relative luminance. It simply burns, as it has been designed to burn, as completely and as consistently as its nature allows. There is something in this that the mind, moving towards sleep, finds deeply restful. The consistency of it, the absence of effort, the simple, undemonstrative fact of a thing doing what it's meant to do, without variance and without complaint, in the dark as in the dusk, at 5 in the morning as at 5 in the evening. The stars are going now, not all of them, not at once. The brightest are still visible, will be visible for another hour in the west, where the sky is still dark enough to show them, but the thinner stars, the ones that were always barely there at the edges of vision, have gone back into the blue that is replacing the black above the city. The coyote in the wash behind the Sahara Hotel has finished its night's hunting and is moving back toward the shelter of the rock outcrops to the east, where it will spend the day. It passes through the parking lot of the hotel with the unhurried confidence of an animal that has been doing this longer than the parking lot has existed, which is by any relevant measure true. It looks at nothing, stops for nothing, proceeds with the absolute self-sufficiency of a creature that has its own business and its own schedule and its own relationship with this landscape that predates by a very long time any human claim upon it. The desert has no particular interest in the human drama that continues in the building the coyote is passing. It does not note the sleeping wealthy man in his darkened suite. It does not observe the neon above the hotel entrance, still burning, still declaring its name and its services, to a street that has no one on it to read the declaration. It does not mark the quiet of the kitchen where bread is baking, or the emptiness of the gaming room where the overnight dealers are managing the needs of the 3 remaining players who have not yet released themselves to sleep. The desert simply continues, as it has always continued, as it will continue long after the last neon has gone dark and the last hotel has been repurposed or demolished, and the desert has reclaimed, grain by grain, the asphalt and the concrete and the foundations that have temporarily interrupted its surface. This is not a sad thought. It is, if you receive it correctly, a deeply comforting one. The permanence of the desert, the indifference of the desert, the absolute reliability of the desert's continuing. These are not threats but reassurances. The world is larger than your concerns. The morning is coming whether you sleep or not. The sun will rise above the spring mountains with complete predictability, illuminating a landscape that does not require anything of you in order to be beautiful. You can simply be in it, rest in it. Let the world proceed without your particular management of it. For these hours of sleep and quiet and the specific freedom that sleep provides from the ordinary need to be present and attentive and engaged. The neon is burning, the bread is baking, the coyote has reached its rocks. The sky is lightening by degrees too small for the eye to track from moment to moment, revealing itself to be changing only across the intervals of minutes, the way all genuinely large changes occur. Too slowly to watch, too completely to miss. Sleep now. The morning will manage itself. The desert will be there when you wake, and Las Vegas, improbable, brilliant, constructed of pure desire in the middle of ancient nothing, will be there too, as it always is, as it always was, burning through the dark, waiting for the next evening, waiting for you. Let the lights dim, very slowly, not all at once, not the abrupt extinction of a switch being thrown, but gradually the way a fire dies in a grate, losing brilliance by degrees until what remains is a warm and comfortable glow that requires no attention, that asks nothing of you. The strip is quieting, not silent. Las Vegas is never silent. But the particular energy of the peak evening hours is fading now, giving way to the different, softer energy of the late night, the small hours, the time when even the most committed celebrant begins to feel the weight of rest gathering behind their eyes. Somewhere below, in a corridor panelled in warm wood, a housekeeper is making her rounds with unhurried care, straightening, adjusting, preparing for the morning without disturbing the night. In the gaming rooms the crowds have thinned. A few serious players remain at the tables, their focus undimmed by the hour, their movements as economical and practised as they were at 9 in the evening. But the festive density of the peak hours is gone, and in its absence the rooms feel almost peaceful. The desert outside is dark. Not entirely dark. The lights of the strip reach out some distance into the surrounding night, casting a pallor on the nearest roads and parking areas and the edges of the desert itself. But beyond that pallor, the Mojave is what it has always been, vast and still and full of its own ancient life. The coyotes moving through the sage, the stars wheeling overhead in their enormous patient arcs, the mountains dark against a sky that is never fully black. You are in your room. The room is quiet. The air is at exactly the right temperature, cool enough to sleep comfortably under a proper blanket, warm enough that the night air from the desert does not carry any chill. The curtains are drawn, the heavy curtains, the ones that block the light entirely, but somehow you know, without seeing it, that the desert is out there, dark and immense, and indifferent, and beautiful. The city was extraordinary. The city was a dream constructed in the middle of nowhere by people who understood, better than perhaps anyone else at that particular moment in American history, what the very wealthy truly wanted. Not spectacle, in the end. Or not only spectacle, the feeling of being attended to, the feeling of being known specifically and accurately and cared for with that knowledge, the feeling that the world has arranged itself just for a few days to meet you exactly where you are, exactly as you are, without asking anything of you in return except your presence. That feeling, that is what Las Vegas sold in those years, in its highest rooms at its highest tables for its most extraordinary guests. And the extraordinary thing, the thing worth remembering, worth carrying into sleep with you on this particular night, is that the feeling was real, not manufactured, not an illusion. Real. The warmth of it, the specific weight of a heavy curtain falling across a window, the sound of a piano, very distant now, playing something you half recognize from somewhere you cannot quite place. Let it carry you. You are safe, you are attended to, you are in the most comfortable place you have ever been, and there is nothing required of you now but sleep. The desert is dark, the stars are turning, the city glows, and you rest. Thank you so much for watching. If you would like to see more videos like this, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel, as it really helps us continue making more content. Anyways, see you in the next one.